Moral disgust. You see it in their face before they even speak. The slight curl of the lip. The instinctive step back. The way their expression hardens. They're not just disagreeing with what someone did. They're repulsed by it. Not angry, not disappointed, disgusted. And that shift from judgment to revulsion changes everything. When disgust enters moral judgment, it stops being a thought. It becomes a visceral rejection. You don't debate with disgust. You recoil from it. The body responds before the mind can intervene, treating moral violations the way it treats rotten food. It's automatic. A defense mechanism designed to create distance between you and the threat. This is moral disgust, the psychological reaction that turns ethical violations into physical repulsion. And it operates through contamination logic. When something disgusts you, proximity feels dangerous. Being near it, touching it, even thinking about it too long feels tainting. That's why moral disgust doesn't just lead to disagreement. It leads to avoidance, exclusion, dehumanization. The person who violated the boundary isn't just wrong. They're contaminated. And contamination spreads. This shows up everywhere. Someone lies repeatedly, and eventually people stop engaging with them entirely. Not because the lies are refutable, but because interacting feels dirty. A colleague crosses an ethical line at work, and suddenly no one wants to sit near them at lunch. The violation lingers like a stain, and proximity to that person feels like it might transfer. What makes moral disgust so powerful is that it bypasses rational evaluation. You don't weigh evidence. You don't consider context. You feel the revulsion, and the feeling becomes the verdict. The person who triggers it gets sorted into a category that no longer deserves empathy. And once that classification happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Disgust doesn't fade with time. It reinforces itself. Every time you see the person, every time the name comes up, every interaction reminds you why you felt repulsed in the first place. The mechanism doesn't just protect moral boundaries. It weaponizes them. Once you attach disgust to a behavior, you're not just condemning the action. You're condemning the person. Permanently. And that permanence is what makes it so dangerous. It doesn't allow for growth, change, or redemption. It creates a category of people who are simply unacceptable. And proximity to them becomes a moral risk in itself. Contamination fear. A friend borrows your jacket. When they return it, you notice a small stain. You wash it immediately, maybe twice. But even after it's clean, something lingers. The next time you reach for it, there's a hesitation. You know it's fine. Logically, it's perfectly clean. But some part of you remembers the stain. That memory, that invisible mark, stays with the object longer than the dirt ever did. This is contamination fear. The feeling that contact with certain things leaves a permanent taint. It's not about germs. It's not about actual danger. It's about the idea of impurity transferring through touch, spreading invisibly, leaving something behind that can never fully be washed away. And once that idea takes hold, it doesn't matter what you know. The feeling overrides the logic. The effect works through symbolic thinking. Your brain treats contamination as if it is substance, as if touching something impure transfers an invisible residue that clings to you. This is why people throw away perfectly good items after learning they were handled by someone they dislike. The object itself didn't change, but the association did. And that association becomes a form of contamination that no amount of cleaning can remove. You see this in relationships constantly. A partner cheats, and suddenly everything they've touched feels tainted. Their side of the bed, their coffee mug, the gifts they gave. People get rid of all of it, not because the objects carry any real trace of betrayal, but because they carry the memory of it. The contamination isn't physical, it's psychological. And psychological contamination is far harder to eliminate. What's remarkable is how little contact it takes. A single touch, a brief interaction, Even proximity can be enough. Someone you distrust shakes your hand, and you wash it immediately, scrubbing harder than the situation warrants. A stranger sits in your seat on the train, and when you return it feels different, less yours. Slightly spoiled by their presence. The contamination spreads not through substance, but through the idea of transfer. And the fear doesn't stay contained. It generalizes. One bad experience with a certain type of person, and suddenly everyone who resembles them feels slightly contaminated by association. One unpleasant interaction in a specific location, and that place carries a residue. You avoid it long after the event has passed. The contamination becomes a lens. You start seeing threat and impurity in places where they may not actually exist. The psychology is rooted in survival. Avoiding contamination kept early humans safe from disease and spoiled food. But the same system that protected us from real threats now activates in response to symbolic ones. Moral violations. Social disgust. Even ideas you find repellent can trigger the same avoidance response as rotten meat. And once that response is triggered, it rewires how you see the contaminated object, person, or place. The feeling outlasts the fact. The avoidance becomes automatic. Contamination fear doesn't just affect objects. It shapes social hierarchies. People who are seen as contaminated get excluded, isolated, marked as untouchable. And the fear spreads through communities, creating boundaries that no one crosses, separating the pure from the impure. The mechanism is invisible, but its effects are everywhere, quietly shaping who you trust, what you touch, and who you allow close. Self-disgust. You apologize even when you're not wrong. You second-guess every word you said. You replay conversations, searching for proof that you're exactly as terrible as you suspect. And when you find it, when you catch yourself in a mistake or a misstep, the feeling that rises isn't just regret. It's revulsion. Directed inward. At yourself, self-disgust is the psychological state where you become the object of your own contempt. The same mechanism that makes you recoil from rotten food or moral violations turns on you. Your flaws, your mistakes, your perceived inadequacies trigger the same visceral rejection. And unlike disgust aimed at external threats, this one doesn't create distance. It traps you. Because you can't escape yourself. The reaction operates on the same contamination logic as external disgust. But instead of avoiding a person or object, you internalize the feeling of being fundamentally tainted. Unworthy, defective. Every error becomes evidence of something rotten at your core. And the more you focus on it, the more you find. Your mind scans for flaws, treats normal human mistakes as confirmation of your worst beliefs, and builds a narrative where you are the problem that can't be fixed. It shows up in the smallest moments. You say something awkward at a meeting, and hours later you're still cringing, unable to let it go. A friend doesn't reply to your text immediately, and you assume it's because they've finally realized how exhausting you are. You look in the mirror and feel a flash of something sharper than dissatisfaction. A sense that the person looking back is fundamentally wrong. What makes self-disgust so damaging is that it doesn't stay abstract. It becomes physical. You avoid mirrors. You shrink in social situations, convinced that others see what you see. You withdraw, not because you want isolation, but because you believe your presence contaminates the space around you. The feeling doesn't just affect your thoughts. It shapes your posture, your voice, the way you move through the world. And it feeds on itself. The more you feel disgusted by yourself, the more you behave in ways that reinforce the feeling. You apologize excessively, seek reassurance compulsively, or sabotage relationships before they can reject you first. Then you look at those behaviors and feel even more disgusted. The cycle tightens, and breaking it becomes harder the longer it runs, because the disgust convinces you that you deserve to feel this way. Self-disgust doesn't resolve by trying to feel better about yourself. It resolves by recognizing that the disgust response, the one designed to protect you from real threats, has been hijacked, turned against you. And what feels like truth is actually a malfunction, a defense system attacking the wrong target. Disgust sensitivity. Two people walk past the same trash bin. One barely notices. The other holds their breath, steps wide, and feels a wave of nausea rising. Same stimulus. Completely different worlds. And that difference, that gulf in how intensely someone reacts to the same trigger, reveals something fundamental about how disgust operates. It's not universal. It's personal. Disgust sensitivity is the measure of how easily and intensely someone experiences disgust. Some people have a low threshold. A faint smell, a minor mess. The thought of certain foods is enough to trigger a strong physical reaction. Others have a high threshold. They can tolerate things that would make most people recoil without feeling much of anything. And this variation shapes more than just how you respond to gross stimuli. It shapes your relationships, your politics, your sense of what's acceptable. The sensitivity is biological, rooted in how your brain and body are wired. Some people's disgust systems are set to high alert, scanning constantly for potential contamination. Their response is faster, stronger, harder to suppress. Others have a more relaxed system, less reactive, less prone to triggering. Neither is better or worse. But the consequences are real. People with high disgust sensitivity avoid more. They're pickier about food, more vigilant about cleanliness, more uncomfortable with bodily fluids or decay. They're also more likely to experience moral disgust intensely, to feel visceral repulsion toward behaviors they see as impure or deviant. Their boundaries are stricter. Their reactions are harder, and they tend to view the world through a lens of threat and contamination that others don't see. People with low disgust sensitivity move through life differently. They're more tolerant of mess, more willing to try unfamiliar foods, less bothered by physical proximity to things others find revolting. They're also less likely to judge behaviors through a disgust framework. Their moral boundaries exist, but they're based on harm or fairness, not purity. They don't feel the same visceral recoil that drives others to exclusion. What's striking is how invisible this difference is until it matters. You don't notice that your friend gags at the thought of expired milk while you just shrug and pour it out. You don't realize that what feels like a minor inconvenience to you feels like a threat to someone else. But when those differences collide in shared living spaces, in relationships, in political debates about purity and boundaries, the gap becomes undeniable. And neither side can fully understand why the other reacts the way they do. Disgust sensitivity doesn't just affect what you avoid. It affects who you trust, what you believe, and how you judge the world around you. And recognizing that your response is shaped by sensitivity, not objective reality, is the first step towards seeing that not everyone lives in the same sensory world you do. Purity psychology. You wash your hands, then you wash them again. Not because they're dirty. You can see they're clean, but the feeling won't go away. The sense that something invisible is still there, clinging to your skin, waiting to spread. So you wash them once more, and the relief lasts only until the doubt creeps back in. This is purity psychology, the deep-rooted need to maintain a sense of cleanliness, both physical and symbolic. It's the force behind compulsive washing, the discomfort with moral ambiguity, the anxiety that certain thoughts or actions have left a stain that can't be scrubbed away. And it operates on a logic that doesn't care about facts. It cares about feelings, about the belief that purity is something you can lose and contamination is something that spreads. The psychology is ancient, wired into human survival. Early humans who avoided contamination, who kept clean, who stayed vigilant about what they touched and ate, lived longer. That instinct protected them from disease, from parasites, from poisoned food. But the same system that kept them safe now activates in response to things that carry no real threat. Moral violations, perceived impurities, even thoughts that feel wrong. And once the system is triggered, it doesn't turn off easily. You feel contaminated, so you engage in cleansing rituals. Washing. Confessing. apologizing, trying to undo the feeling of being tainted. But the rituals don't address the root belief. They reinforce it. Because every time you wash your hands to feel pure again, you're confirming that the contamination was real, that the threat existed, and the next time the feeling arises, the urge to cleanse becomes stronger. This shows up in relationships as moral cleansing. Someone feels guilty about a thought or a minor transgression, and they confess compulsively, seeking reassurance that they're still good. They apologize excessively, not because they've caused real harm, but because the internal sense of being tainted feels unbearable. And the reassurance only works temporarily. The feeling returns and the cycle repeats. It shows up in group dynamics as purity enforcement. Communities develop strict boundaries about what's acceptable, not just in behavior but in thought. Deviation from the norm feels like contamination. And anyone who crosses the line gets treated as impure, someone who threatens the group's cleanliness. The enforcement isn't about harm. It's about maintaining the illusion that purity can be preserved, if only the contaminated are kept out. What makes purity psychology so powerful is that it feels like truth. The sense of contamination feels real. The need to cleanse feels urgent. And resisting it feels dangerous, like allowing something toxic to spread. But the contamination isn't real. It's a feeling. And treating it as fact only strengthens its grip. Purity psychology doesn't resolve by achieving perfect cleanliness. It resolves by recognizing that contamination is a sensation, not a state. That the feeling of being impure doesn't mean you are. And that the rituals meant to restore purity are the very thing keeping the fear alive. Body disgust. You see your reflection and something tightens in your chest. Not sadness. Not quite shame. Something sharper. A visceral recoil from your own body, as if looking at yourself triggers the same response as something spoiled or broken. You turn away. You avoid mirrors. You dress in ways that hide what you can't stand to see. And the feeling doesn't fade. It sits there, constant, a low hum of revulsion directed at the body you live in. Body disgust is the experience of feeling physically repulsed by your own appearance or physical sensations. It's not dissatisfaction. It's not wishing you looked different. It's the same disgust response that makes you pull away from rotten food, except it's aimed at yourself, your skin, your shape, the way your body moves or feels. And once that response is activated, it rewires how you experience being in your body. The reaction operates through the same contamination logic that drives other forms of disgust. Your body becomes the object you want to avoid. You stop looking at it. You stop touching it. You disconnect from physical sensations because feeling your body means confronting the thing that disgusts you. And the more you avoid, the stronger the disgust becomes. Because avoidance confirms the threat. It shows up in how you dress. Clothes become armor chosen not for style but for concealment. You layer. You cover. You cover. You avoid anything that reveals the parts of your body you find repulsive. And even when you're alone, the discomfort doesn't leave. You shower quickly, eyes averted. You change clothes without looking. You move through physical space as if your body is something to be hidden, not inhabited. It shows up in relationships. Physical intimacy becomes unbearable, not because you don't want connection, but because being touched means someone else is interacting with the thing you find disgusting. You flinch. You pull away. You assume that if you feel repulsed by your body, others must too. And that assumption becomes a barrier you can't cross, no matter how much reassurance you receive. What makes body disgust so damaging is that it doesn't stay contained in your thoughts. It becomes physical. Your posture changes. You hunch, trying to take up less space. Your breathing becomes shallow. You move stiffly, as if occupying your body is something you're doing wrong. And the disgust feeds on itself. The more you disconnect from your body, the more foreign it feels. And the more foreign it feels, the easier it is to see it as something repulsive. Body disgust doesn't resolve by changing your appearance. It resolves by recognizing that the disgust response has been misdirected. Your body isn't the threat. The response is. And treating the feeling as truth only deepens the disconnection. The body you're trying to escape is the one you have to live in. And learning to tolerate it, not love it, just tolerate it without recoiling, is where the shift begins. Pathogen avoidance. Someone sneezes near you on the bus. You don't think. You hold your breath. You turn away. You wipe your hands on your jacket even though they didn't touch anything. The response is instant, automatic, older than conscious thought. Your body already decided that proximity to illness is a threat, and distance is the only answer. This system, pathogen avoidance, is one of the most ancient survival mechanisms humans possess. It evolved to keep you away from disease before you understood what disease was. Before germ theory, before antibiotics, the people who instinctively recoiled from the sick survived. The ones who didn't. And that instinct is still running every day, shaping who you avoid and what you touch without you realizing it. The mechanism works by detecting cues: coughing, pale skin, visible sores, unusual smells. Your brain registers these signals and triggers disgust before you can evaluate whether the threat is real. The feeling rises, sharp and immediate, and you pull back. Not because you've reasoned through the risk, but because your body treats the cue as danger. And the system doesn't require accuracy. It overacts by design. Better to avoid someone who's perfectly healthy but looks unwell than to risk contact with someone contagious. The cost of a false alarm is low. The cost of missing a real threat is death. So the system errs on the side of caution, and that caution looks like disgust. You see it in everyday life. Someone looks tired, a little off, and you keep your distance without thinking about it. A coworker mentions they're not feeling well, and you avoid shaking their hand. A stranger on the train has a persistent cough, and you change seats. The avoidance feels rational, justified. But it's not a decision. It's the pathogen avoidance system doing what it was built to do. The problem is that the system can't distinguish between actual disease and harmless variation. Skin conditions that aren't contagious trigger the same response as infectious illness. Physical disabilities that have nothing to do with pathogens activate the same avoidance. The system sees deviation from the norm and treats it as contamination. And the person on the receiving end of that response gets excluded, not because they pose a threat, but because they trigger an ancient reflex that doesn't know the difference. Pathogen avoidance doesn't just protect you from disease. It creates social boundaries, determining who gets included and who gets pushed to the margins. And those boundaries aren't based on real risk. They're based on cues that your brain interprets as danger, whether the danger exists or not. Social disgust. Watch how people react when someone violates an unspoken rule. They don't argue. They don't explain why it's wrong. They grimace. They exchange glances. They distance themselves, physically and emotionally, as if the violation itself is something contagious. And in a way, it is. Social disgust is the feeling of repulsion triggered by behaviors that threaten group cohesion. It's not about harm in the physical sense. It's about deviation. Someone acts in a way the group finds unacceptable, and the disgust response kicks in, creating pressure to conform or be excluded. The emotion serves as enforcement, a way of marking boundaries without needing explicit rules. The triggers vary by culture, by context, by the group's values. In some settings, it's talking too loudly in public. In others, it's failing to acknowledge hierarchy. In close-knit communities, it might be something as minor as dressing differently or choosing the wrong friends. The specific behavior doesn't matter. What matters is that it signals you're not aligned with the group's norms. And that misalignment feels threatening. The disgust operates through the same contamination logic as other forms. The person who violated the norm becomes tainted. Their presence feels uncomfortable. Others avoid sitting near them, stop inviting them, talk about them with that particular tone that signals they've been marked. And the disgust spreads. One person's reaction influences the next, creating a collective response that reinforces the boundary. What makes social disgust effective is that it doesn't require conscious coordination. No one needs to decide that this person should be excluded. The feeling does the work. You feel disgusted, so you pull back. Others feel it too, and they pull back. And the person who triggered it is left isolated, not because anyone planned it, but because the group's disgust created distance automatically. The person on the receiving end often doesn't understand what happened. They know they're being avoided, but the reason feels vague, unspoken. They replay interactions, searching for the violation, and often can't pinpoint it, because the rule they broke wasn't written down. It was felt. And disgust doesn't explain itself. It just pushes you away. Social disgust doesn't just enforce norms. It punishes difference. Anyone who stands out, who doesn't conform, who challenges the group's assumptions becomes a target. And the group doesn't need to justify the exclusion. The disgust itself feels like justification enough. Sexual disgust. There's a version of attraction that never gets talked about. Not desire. Not interest. The opposite. The visceral recoil that happens when someone crosses a line, when intimacy shifts from wanted to repulsive in an instant. It's not anger. It's not fear. It's disgust, sharp and physical, and it changes everything about how you see the interaction. Sexual disgust is the psychological response that makes certain sexual contexts, behaviors, or partners feel fundamentally wrong. It's the same disgust mechanism that protects you from contamination, except it's aimed at sexual situations that violate your boundaries or sense of what's acceptable. And once triggered, it doesn't fade easily. The function is protective. It keeps you away from sexual encounters that might harm you, either physically or psychologically. Incest triggers disgust universally, an evolved response that prevents genetic harm. Coercion triggers it. Contexts that feel degrading or dehumanizing trigger it. The disgust creates a barrier, making certain acts feel impossible rather than just undesirable. But the system also responds to learned boundaries. What disgusts one person sexually might not disgust another. Cultural norms shape it. Personal experience shapes it. Trauma rewires it entirely, expanding the range of what feels threatening until even safe intimacy can trigger the response. And once disgust is take to a sexual context, approaching it becomes unbearable. It shows up in relationships as a wall that won't come down. One partner wants closeness, and the other feels repulsion. Not rejection in the usual sense. Something deeper. The body refuses. The thought alone feels contaminating. And explaining it is impossible because disgust doesn't translate into words. It just sits there, blocking access to intimacy that might otherwise be wanted. It shows up after betrayal. A partner cheats and suddenly their touch feels wrong, not just unwanted. Disgusting. The sexual connection that once existed becomes unthinkable. The disgust doesn't care that you might still love them, that you might want to repair things. It creates a physical barrier that overrides intention. What makes sexual disgust so isolating is that it's not socially acceptable to discuss. You're expected to want intimacy, to enjoy it, to be open. Admitting that certain contexts make you feel disgusted carries shame, as if the disgust itself is the problem. But the disgust is a response. It's signaling a boundary that matters. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes the feeling sharper, the avoidance more complete, and the distance harder to bridge. Core disgust. Picture the moment you realize the milk has gone bad. The smell hits. Your face contorts before you decide to react. Your stomach turns. You step back instinctively, putting distance between yourself and the source. You didn't choose that response. It happened to you. Core disgust is the most basic, universal form of the emotion. It evolved to protect you from ingesting harmful substances. Rotten food. Bodily waste. Decay. The things that could poison you if you consumed them. And the response is the same across cultures, across ages, hardwired into human biology from birth. Infants show it. Before they understand language, before they learn social norms, they recoil from bitter tastes and foul smells. The disgust is already there, preset, designed to keep them alive before they know what danger is. And that foundation never goes away. It just gets built on. The physical reaction is distinct. The nose wrinkles. The upper lip curls. The mouth opens slightly as if preparing to expel something. These expressions are universal, recognized across every culture studied. And they happen automatically. You can't fake core disgust convincingly, and you can't suppress it fully once it's triggered. The body takes over. What's remarkable is how little it takes to activate. A smell, a visual cue. Even the thought of something disgusting can trigger nausea. Your brain doesn't need the substance to be present. The memory of rotting meat, the image of maggots, the idea of consuming something contaminated is enough to produce the same response as actual exposure. Core disgust doesn't just protect you in the moment. It creates lasting associations. Touch something disgusting once, and you'll avoid it indefinitely. Eat something that made you sick, and the taste alone will trigger revulsion years later. The disgust imprints, creating a memory that persists long after the threat has passed. And the response generalizes. One bad experience with a type of food, and similar foods become suspect. A single exposure to decay in a specific location, and that place carries the association. The disgust spreads beyond the original source, creating avoidance patterns that extend far wider than the actual risk. Core disgust is the foundation all other disgust builds on. Moral disgust borrows its intensity. Social disgust uses its contamination logic. Sexual disgust triggers the same physical response. They all trace back to this simple, ancient system designed to keep poison out of your body. But what started as protection from physical harm became a tool for navigating the social world, and the lines between them are thinner than they seem. Animal reminder disgust. You're cutting raw chicken, and your hands feel slippery. The texture is wrong. Too soft. Too yielding. And suddenly you're aware of what it is. Flesh. Muscle. Something that was alive. The awareness makes your stomach tighten. You wash your hands longer than necessary, trying to scrub away not just the residue but the feeling. This is animal reminder disgust, the visceral reaction to anything that forces you to confront your own animal nature. Bodily fluids. Organs. Decay. The reminder that beneath the surface, you're made of the same meat, the same processes, the same mortality. And that reminder feels unbearable. Humans spend enormous effort maintaining distance from our animal status. We cover our bodies. We control our smells. We hide the processes of digestion, elimination, reproduction. We create rituals around death to avoid confronting the physical reality of a corpse. All of it serves to preserve the illusion that we're different, that we transcend our biology. But the reminders break through. You see an injury, and the sight of exposed tissue triggers disgust. You smell something organic decaying, and the revulsion is immediate. You encounter bodily fluids outside the controlled contexts we've normalized, and the response is to recoil. Because in that moment, the boundary between human and animal thins, and you're forced to recognize what you work so hard to forget. The disgust extends to anything associated with the body's basic functions. Sweat in excess. Visible signs of illness. The sounds and smells that remind you of digestion. Even sex, in its most physical form, can trigger this response when it feels too raw, too animal, stripped of the romance and intimacy that usually frame it. What makes this form of disgust particularly uncomfortable is that it's directed at something you can't escape. You are an animal. Your body performs these functions constantly. And every time you're reminded, the disgust tells you to distance yourself from something that's fundamentally part of who you are. It shows up in how we treat the dying and the dead. The body becomes an object of disgust, something to be clean, covered, removed from view as quickly as possible. Not out of disrespect, but because the physical reality of death is an undeniable reminder that this is everyone's fate, and confronting that directly feels intolerable. Animal reminder disgust doesn't protect you from actual danger. It protects you from a psychological threat, the anxiety of recognizing your mortality and your animal nature. But that protection comes at a cost. It creates shame around normal bodily processes. It makes physical vulnerability feel like something to hide. And it reinforces the illusion that you're separate from your body, when in reality you are your body, and the disgust aimed at it is disgust aimed at yourself. Moral contamination. A politician takes money from a corrupt source. Years later, after the scandal is forgotten, they endorse a policy you support. And even though the policy itself makes sense, even though you agree with the reasoning, something feels wrong. You can't support it. Not because of the policy, because of who's behind it. The association taints everything they touch. Moral contamination is the feeling that someone's ethical violations have left a stain that spreads to everything connected to them. Their ideas, their projects, the people who associate with them. The contamination doesn't follow logic. It follows association. And once the stain is there, it's nearly impossible to remove. The psychology operates like physical contamination. You wouldn't eat food touched by something disgusting, even if the food itself is clean. The contact is enough. And the same principle applies to moral judgments. A person does something you find reprehensible, and now everything associated with them carries that taint. Their work loses value. Their opinions become suspect. Their presence in a project makes the entire project feel compromised. This shows up in how we handle public figures. One revelation about their past behavior, and their entire legacy gets reassessed. Books get pulled. Artwork gets removed, not because the work itself changed, but because the association with the creator now feels contaminating. The audience can't separate the creation from the creator, because contamination doesn't recognize boundaries. It shows up in social circles. Someone you trusted does something unethical, and suddenly mutual friends who defend them feel tainted too. You start questioning their judgment, their values, their character. Not because they did anything wrong, but because their continued association with the contaminated person spreads the stain. You avoid them, not out of anger, but because proximity feels risky. What makes moral contamination so powerful is that it bypasses proportionality. A minor ethical lapse can produce the same contamination effect as a major one, if the disgust response is strong enough. And there's no statute of limitations. Actions from decades ago can contaminate the present as thoroughly as something that happened yesterday. The contamination also resists counter-evidence. Someone does good work after a moral failure, and it doesn't cleanse them. It gets reinterpreted as an attempt to cover the stain or dismissed as irrelevant. Because once contamination is established, the person isn't just judged for what they did. They're permanently marked as contaminated. And contamination in the logic of disgust doesn't wash away. Moral contamination doesn't just affect individuals. It affects entire movements, organizations, institutions. One member's misconduct can taint the whole group. One unethical practice can make everything the organization does feel suspect. And the contamination spreads faster than facts, because disgust doesn't wait for investigation. It reacts, and the reaction becomes the reality. Disgust-based avoidance. Two people receive the same invitation to a party. One accepts immediately. The other hesitates, feels a tightness in their chest, and declines without a clear reason. They both know the same people will be there. They both have the time. But for one of them, the thought of attending triggers something they can't name. Not anxiety, not disinterest. A quiet, persistent sense that being in that space would feel wrong. Disgust-based avoidance is the pattern of staying away from people, places, or situations not because of conscious reasoning, but because they trigger a disgust response that makes proximity feel unbearable. The avoidance feels justified in the moment, natural, like common sense. But it's not based on actual threat. It's based on a feeling that's been attached to something and won't let go. The mechanism runs automatically. You don't sit down and decide to avoid the person who disgusts you. You just find reasons not to be around them. You skip events where they'll be present. You take different routes. You keep conversations short. The disgust does the work for you, creating distance without requiring deliberate effort. And the avoidance reinforces the disgust. Every time you pull away, you confirm that the person or place is something to be avoided. The feeling strengthens. The boundary hardens. What started as mild discomfort becomes complete exclusion. And you never have to confront whether the disgust was warranted, because you're no longer in contact with the thing that triggered it. It shows up in relationships that slowly dissolve. You stop initiating contact. You let messages go unanswered. You're always busy when plans are suggested. The other person notices the distance but doesn't understand why. And you can't explain it, because the disgust doesn't translate into words. You just know that being around them feels uncomfortable in a way that makes continued connection impossible. It shows up in career choices. Certain fields feel off limits, not because you lack the skills, but because something about the work triggers disgust. Medical professions for people who can't handle bodily fluids. Service jobs for people disgusted by physical proximity to strangers. The avoidance shapes entire life paths, closing doors before they're even considered. What makes disgust-based avoidance so insidious is that it operates beneath awareness. You think you're making rational decisions about who to spend time with and where to go. But the disgust is filtering your choices, narrowing your world without you realizing it. And the more you avoid, the smaller your world becomes, and the harder it is to recognize that the boundaries weren't chosen. They were felt. Purity violation response. Someone tells you they reuse plastic water bottles. Your reaction is instant. Not logical concern about bacteria. Something sharper. A flash of revulsion, a sense that what they're doing is fundamentally wrong. You don't think about contamination rates or health risks. You just feel it. And the feeling is enough to shift how you see them. The purity violation response is what happens when someone crosses a boundary you've internalized as sacred. Not moral in the traditional sense. Purity. Cleanliness. The right way to do things. And when that boundary is crossed, the response isn't disagreement. It's disgust. The kind that makes you pull back, both physically and emotionally. These boundaries vary wildly. For some, it's about food. Mixing certain ingredients, eating with hands, consuming things past arbitrary dates. For others, it's hygiene rituals. Skipping hand washing, wearing shoes indoors, not showering immediately after the gym. The specific rule doesn't matter. What matters is that violating it feels like contamination, and the person who violated it becomes associated with impurity. The response bypasses reason. You could explain why the boundary doesn't make sense. You could point out that the risk is minimal or non-existent. But the disgust doesn't care. It's already decided that the violation is unacceptable, and now the person who committed it carries the stain. You see it in judgments that feel moral but are actually about purity. Someone lives in a cluttered space, and you feel disgusted. Not because clutter harms anyone, but because it violates your sense of how things should be maintained. Someone eats food you find disgusting, and their choice feels like a character flaw. The violation of purity standards becomes a proxy for deeper judgments about the person's worth. And the response spreads. One purity violation, and you start noticing others. The person who reuses bottles also wears the same clothes multiple days in a row. They don't sanitize their phone. They share food directly from containers. Each observation reinforces the initial disgust, building a case that they're fundamentally unclean. And the case feels objective when it's entirely based on your internal standards. Purity violation responses don't protect you from harm. They protect you from discomfort, from having your sense of order and cleanliness challenged. But they do it by turning people into categories. Clean or unclean. Acceptable or contaminated. And once someone is sorted into the wrong category, everything they do gets filtered through that lens. Food contamination aversion. You're at a restaurant. The server brings your meal, and as they set it down, their thumb dips slightly into the sauce. For a fraction of a second. Barely noticeable. But you saw it. And now the food is ruined. Not spoiled in any objective sense. You know the risk is negligible. But the thought of eating it makes your stomach turn. Food contamination aversion is the disgust response that makes food feel inedible after contact with something you perceive as impure. The contact can be minimal. A fly landing on your plate, a hair you find in your soup, someone else's fork touching your food. The contamination doesn't follow logic. A molecule of contact is treated the same as complete saturation. Once the food is tainted, it's untouchable. The aversion is rooted in survival. Spoiled food can kill you. Contaminated water can make you sick. The disgust response evolved to keep you away from things that might harm you if consumed. But the system doesn't distinguish between real threats and symbolic ones. It reacts to the idea of contamination with the same intensity as actual danger. And the reaction is visceral. You can't reason yourself out of it. You know the food is safe. You know the contact was trivial. But the disgust overrides the logic. The thought of eating it produces nausea, and no amount of rational evaluation makes the feeling go away. It shows up in waste. Perfectly good food gets thrown away because it touched something that triggered the aversion. A meal abandoned because you noticed something off. Groceries discarded because the packaging was dented. The loss isn't about safety. It's about the impossibility of consuming something that feels contaminated. It shows up in social situations. You can't eat food someone else prepared if you saw them handle it in a way that disgusted you. You can't share meals with people whose hygiene standards don't match yours. The aversion creates invisible boundaries that make shared eating, one of the most basic social rituals, feel unbearable. What makes food contamination aversion so rigid is that it doesn't respond to evidence. You can test the food. You can verify it's safe. But the disgust remains. Because the contamination isn't factual. It's perceptual. And once your brain has categorized something as contaminated, it stays that way, no matter what the facts say. Contact contamination. Shake hands with someone you distrust, and the feeling doesn't stop when the handshake ends. It lingers on your skin. You want to wash immediately. Not because your hand is dirty in any measurable way, but because the contact left something behind. Something you can't see but can't ignore. This is contact contamination, the sensation that touching something impure transfers a residue that clings to you. The transfer isn't real. No substance has moved from one surface to another. But your brain treats the contact as if it has, and the feeling persists until you perform some ritual to cleanse it. The psychology operates on magical thinking. You know, intellectually, that shaking someone's hand doesn't leave a moral stain on yours. But the feeling tells you otherwise. And the feeling is stronger than the knowledge. So you wash. You scrub. You try to remove something that was never there in the first place. The contamination follows rules that make no logical sense. A brief touch can feel as contaminating as prolonged contact. Indirect transfer works the same as direct. If someone you find disgusting touches an object, and then you touch that object, you feel contaminated by proxy. The chain of contact doesn't dilute the effect. It spreads it. You see this with money. Physical currency passes through countless hands, but you don't think about it until you know it came from someone specific. Then it feels different. tainted. You handle it differently, hold it at a distance, want to get rid of it as quickly as possible. The physical object didn't change. Your perception of its contamination did. You see it with gifts. Someone you've grown to dislike gave you something years ago. It's been sitting in your home, untouched, neutral. But once the relationship soars, the object feels contaminated. You can't look at it without remembering who it came from. And eventually you get rid of it. Not because it's broken or useless, but because the association makes keeping it feel like maintaining contact with contamination. What makes contact contamination so persistent is that the feeling doesn't fade with time. Wash your hands once, and the relief is temporary. The thought returns. Did you wash thoroughly enough? Did you really remove it? The doubt creeps back, and with it, the urge to cleanse again. The contamination becomes a loop, and breaking it requires confronting the fact that there was never anything to remove. Mental contamination. Have you ever had a thought you couldn't get rid of? Not a memory. Not a worry. Something that felt wrong just for existing in your mind. And the more you tried to push it away, the more it stuck, until the thought itself started to feel contaminating. As if thinking it made you complicit. As if the idea alone could stain you from the inside. Mental contamination is the experience of feeling dirty or impure because of thoughts, images, or memories even when no physical contact has occurred. The contamination isn't on your skin. It's in your head. And that makes it harder to escape because you can't wash away a thought. The mechanism works through association. You think about something disgusting, and your brain treats the thought as if you've been exposed to the thing itself. The same disgust response activates. The same urge to cleanse arises. But there's nothing external to clean. So the contamination sits there, internal and inescapable, creating distress that can't be resolved through normal rituals. It shows up after trauma. Someone experiences something violating, and the memory of it feels contaminating. They shower compulsively, trying to wash away a feeling that has nothing to do with their body. The contamination is psychological, but it produces the same physical urge to cleanse. And the cleansing doesn't work because the source isn't external. It shows up with intrusive thoughts. A disturbing image enters your mind unbidden. You didn't choose it. You don't want it, but it's there. And now you feel contaminated by having thought it, as if the thought reflects something about who you are. You try to suppress it, but suppression makes it stronger. The more you fight it, the more it intrudes, and the more contaminated you feel. What makes mental contamination particularly cruel is that it punishes you for things you can't control. Thoughts arise spontaneously. Memories resurface without permission. And the contamination response treats them as if they're voluntary, as if thinking something means you've chosen to be impure. The result is a battle against your own mind, where the weapon you're fighting with is the same one being used against you. The contamination doesn't resolve through avoidance. You can't avoid your own thoughts. You can't distance yourself from your mind. And the rituals that work for external contamination, washing, cleaning, distancing, don't address the internal source. The feeling persists, creating a sense of being fundamentally tainted that no external action can fix. Mental contamination blurs the line between thought and action. It makes thinking about something feel morally equivalent to doing it. And that equivalence traps people in cycles of guilt and self-disgust over things that exist only in their heads, punishing them for involuntary mental events as if they were deliberate choices. Disgust conditioning. A child eats a certain food and gets sick, not because the food was bad, just coincidence, a stomach bug that happened to hit the same day. But the brain doesn't care about coincidence. It registers the pairing, food and nausea, and locks it in. Years later, the smell alone triggers revulsion. The child, now an adult, can't eat that food. Can't even be near it. The disgust is permanent, formed in a single experience, and no amount of reasoning undoes it. This is disgust conditioning, the process by which neutral stimuli become triggers for disgust through association. The conditioning happens fast. One pairing is often enough. And once established, it resists change. The disgust doesn't fade with time. It doesn't weaken with exposure. It stays, sometimes for life. The mechanism is simple. Your brain connects two things that occurred together: a stimulus and a disgust response. After that, the stimulus alone is enough to trigger the response. You don't need the original cause anymore. The association carries the feeling forward. It happens with places. You have a bad experience in a specific location, and now being there feels wrong. The place itself didn't change, but your response to it did. Every time you return, the disgust resurfaces, making the space feel permanently tainted. You avoid it when possible, and when you can't, you leave as quickly as you can. It happens with people. Someone does something that disgusts you once, and the feeling it takes to them. Even if they never repeat the behavior, even if they apologize, the association remains. Seeing them brings back the disgust. Their presence becomes a trigger. And the relationship never recovers because the conditioning doesn't care about context or change. What makes disgust conditioning so powerful is its resistance to extinction. Most conditioned responses weaken over time if the pairing isn't reinforced. But disgust conditioning doesn't follow that pattern. You can encounter the stimulus repeatedly without the original cause, and the disgust stays just as strong. The brain holds onto it, treating it as permanent information about what to avoid. The conditioning also generalizes. One bad experience with a type of food, and similar foods become suspect. One disgusting encounter with a person, and people who resemble them trigger the same response. The disgust spreads beyond the original source, creating avoidance patterns that extend far wider than the initial event. Disgust conditioning doesn't just shape what you avoid. It shapes your memories. The conditioned stimulus becomes linked to the disgust, so thoroughly that you can't remember it without the feeling. The food you once enjoyed, the place you used to like, the person you were close to, they're all rewritten by the conditioning. And what's left isn't the original experience. It's the disgust, permanent and unchangeable, redefining the past through a single moment of association. Disgust generalization. One cockroach in your kitchen, and suddenly the entire apartment feels infested. You know logically that one insect doesn't mean there are hundreds. You checked. You cleaned. But the feeling spreads anyway. Every dark corner becomes suspect. Every small sound makes you flinch. The disgust triggered by a single encounter expands to contaminate the whole space. Disgust generalization is the process by which a disgust response to one specific thing spreads to similar things, related things, and eventually to entire categories. The expansion happens automatically. Your brain doesn't carefully evaluate each new stimulus. It sees resemblance, draws association, and applies the same response. One bad apple, and the whole barrel feels spoiled. The spread follows patterns of similarity. Physical resemblance triggers it most reliably. One type of insect disgusts you, and insects that look similar inherit the response. One person with certain features repulses you, and people who share those features become suspect. The disgust doesn't distinguish between the original source and things that merely resemble it. But it also spreads through association. Someone disgusts you, and their friends become tainted by proximity. A location triggers revulsion, and nearby areas start to feel contaminated. The disgust jumps from direct contact to anything connected, building a web of avoidance that extends far beyond the original trigger. You see this with social categories. One negative interaction with someone from a particular group, and the entire group feels different. Not consciously prejudiced. Just a subtle discomfort that makes you avoid them. The generalization doesn't announce itself. It operates beneath awareness, quietly reshaping who you trust and who you keep at a distance. You see it with ideas. Encounter one concept that disgusts you, and related ideas become suspect. The connection doesn't need to be logical. Superficial similarity is enough. Same vocabulary, same source, same general category. The disgust spreads along any available path, creating guilt by association. What makes disgust generalization so problematic is that it's adaptive in the wrong context. If one food made you sick, avoiding similar foods protects you. If one substance contaminated you, staying away from related substances makes sense. But when the same mechanism applies to people, ideas, and social categories, it creates prejudice that feels like instinct. The brain is doing what it evolved to do, keeping you safe from threats. But it can't tell the difference between a toxic mushroom and a person who reminds you of someone who wronged you. The generalization also resists correction. You can learn that the association is false. You can encounter evidence that the category is safe. But the disgust remains. Because it wasn't formed through reasoning, and it doesn't dissolve through reasoning. It formed through pattern recognition, and patterns, once established, are hard to unlearn. Revulsion response. Your stomach lurches. Your throat tightens. Saliva floods your mouth, and for a moment you're certain you're going to be sick. You're not. Nothing's wrong with you physically. But your body reacted as if you'd just consumed poison, and the wave of nausea was so intense it left you shaking. The revulsion response is the extreme physical reaction to disgust triggers, the body's emergency protocol for expelling or avoiding contamination. It's more than discomfort. It's a full system alarm, activating nausea, gagging, and the urge to create distance immediately. And it happens whether the threat is real or entirely psychological. The response is involuntary. You can't suppress it through willpower. The moment the trigger appears, your body takes over. Your face contours. Your upper lip curls. Your nose wrinkles. These aren't conscious expressions. They're automatic signals, both to yourself and to others, that something dangerous is present. Nausea serves a function. If you've ingested something toxic, nausea prepares you to vomit, to expel the substance before it causes harm. But the same response activates when nothing has been ingested, when the trigger is purely visual or conceptual. Your body doesn't distinguish. It treats the idea of contamination with the same urgency as actual poisoning. The intensity varies, but the pattern is consistent. Mild disgust produces discomfort. Strong disgust produces physical revulsion. And once the response reaches a certain threshold, it becomes debilitating. You can't think clearly. You can't stay in the space. The only option is escape, distance, immediate removal from the source. You see this with phobias. Blood, injuries, medical procedures. The revulsion response is so strong that people faint, not from the actual threat, but from their body's overreaction to the trigger. The disgust hijacks the nervous system, producing physical symptoms that are worse than the trigger itself. You see it in social contexts. Someone says something that violates your sense of purity, and the revulsion is physical, not metaphorical discomfort, actual nausea. The words themselves become a contaminant, and your body responds as if you've been exposed to something toxic. What makes the revulsion response so powerful is that it bypasses thought entirely. You don't decide to feel nauseated. You don't choose to gag. The body acts first, and consciousness catches up later, trying to make sense of a reaction that's already in motion. And that reaction, once triggered, creates a memory. The next time you encounter the stimulus, the response comes faster, stronger, more automatic. The revulsion builds on itself, creating a feedback loop where each exposure intensifies the next. Dehumanization through disgust. Throughout history, when groups wanted to justify exclusion, persecution, or violence, they didn't argue with logic. They used disgust. They described the target group as vermin, parasites, filth. Not metaphorically. Literally. The language wasn't meant to persuade. It was meant to trigger revulsion, to make the idea of harming these people feel not just acceptable, but necessary. Like exterminating pests. Dehumanization through disgust is the process of stripping people of their humanity by associating them with things that trigger the contamination response. Once the association is established, the normal moral prohibitions against harming others weaken. Because the targets no longer register as fully human. They register as contaminants. And contaminants don't deserve empathy. They deserve removal. The mechanism exploits the disgust system's original function. Disgust evolved to keep you away from disease, decay, and contamination. But it can be redirected. When a group is repeatedly described using disgust-inducing imagery, animals, insects, bodily waste, the brain starts treating them the way it treats actual contaminants. The response becomes automatic. Seeing them triggers revulsion. And revulsion creates distance. The language is consistent across contexts. Groups targeted for dehumanization get described as dirty, diseased, infesting, spreading. The metaphors aren't random. They're specifically chosen to activate disgust. And once activated, the disgust does the work. People don't need to be convinced that the group is dangerous. They feel it. The revulsion provides its own justification. You see this in propaganda. Images designed to make the target group look physically repulsive. Exaggerated features. Associations with rats, cockroaches, parasites. The goal isn't to inform. It's to condition a disgust response so strong that violence against the group feels like self-defense. Like protecting yourself from contamination. You see it in everyday exclusion. Homeless populations described as blights. Immigrants as invaders. The terminology isn't neutral. It's crafted to trigger disgust, to make the people seem like problems to be solved rather than humans with needs. And once the disgust is triggered, empathy shuts down. You don't help contaminants. You avoid them. You remove them. What makes dehumanization through disgust so effective is that it feels moral. You're not being cruel. You're protecting purity, maintaining standards, keeping things clean. The disgust frames exclusion as hygiene, violence as necessary cleaning. And because disgust is a physical response, it feels true in a way that intellectual arguments don't. The body's reaction becomes the evidence. Dehumanization through disgust doesn't just enable violence. It makes violence feel righteous. And the people committing it don't see themselves as perpetrators. They see themselves as responding appropriately to a contamination threat. The disgust didn't just remove the target's humanity. It removed the moral weight of what was done to them. Purity-based moral judgment. Two people make the same mistake at work. One sends an apology email immediately, the other shrugs it off. Objectively, the error is identical. The impact is the same. But your reaction to the two people couldn't be more different. The one who shrugged feels wrong to you, not just unprofessional. Morally suspect, as if their casual attitude reveals something deeper, something fundamentally flawed about their character. Purity-based moral judgment is the tendency to evaluate people's ethics not by the harm they cause, but by whether they violate standards of cleanliness, propriety, and symbolic purity. The judgment operates through disgust. Someone crosses a purity boundary, and the disgust response frames them as morally inferior. Not because they hurt anyone, because they're impure. The standards themselves vary wildly. In some contexts, it's sexual behavior, promiscuity, unconventional relationships. Anything that deviates from accepted norms triggers moral disgust. In others, it's lifestyle choices. Drug use, certain diets, how someone maintains their living space. The violations don't harm others directly, but they violate purity codes, and that violation feels like a moral failing. The judgment is harsher than harm-based evaluations. Someone causes actual damage but apologizes sincerely, and you might forgive them. Someone violates a purity standard, and the stain doesn't wash off, because harm can be repaired. Purity, once lost, feels permanent. The person is marked, contaminated, and contamination doesn't fade with good behavior. You see this in how we treat public figures. A politician involved in a sex scandal faces different judgment than one caught in financial corruption. The financial harm might be greater, but the sex scandal triggers disgust, and disgust-based judgments are less forgiving. The violation feels personal, visceral, impossible to overlook. You see it in social hierarchies. People judged as impure get excluded, not because they're dangerous, but because their presence feels contaminating. They don't fit the purity standards of the group, and the group treats their moral worth as lower because of it. The judgment isn't about what they've done. It's about what they represent. A violation of the symbolic order. What makes purity-based moral judgment so insidious is that it masquerades as ethics. You're not being prejudiced. You're upholding standards. You're maintaining boundaries. The disgust provides the moral framing, turning personal discomfort into righteous judgment. And because it feels like morality, it's hard to recognize as bias. The judgment also creates hierarchies that have nothing to do with actual virtue. Someone can be kind, generous, honest, but if they violate purity norms, they're judged as morally lesser than someone who maintains purity but lacks compassion. The purity becomes the measure, and everything else becomes secondary. Shame-Disgust Link. You did something embarrassing. Not harmful, not cruel, just awkward. But the feeling that follows isn't just embarrassment. It's deeper. You feel disgusted with yourself, not figuratively. The same physical revulsion you'd feel towards something rotten. Your stomach turns. You can't stop replaying the moment. And the more you think about it, the more the disgust grows until you feel fundamentally wrong. The shame-disgust link is the psychological fusion between two emotions that often occur together but serve different functions. Shame tells you that you've violated social norms, that you've fallen short of what's expected. Disgust tells you something is contaminated and should be avoided. When they merge, shame stops being about behavior and becomes about identity. You're not someone who did something wrong. You're something wrong. The link forms through repeated pairing. You make a mistake, and you feel ashamed. The shame produces discomfort, to desire to hide, to disappear. But if the shame is intense enough, or if it happens frequently, disgust joins it. The feeling of being flawed merges with the feeling of being impure. And once that connection is established, shame triggers disgust automatically. The fusion intensifies both emotions. Shame alone is painful but manageable. You can apologize, make amends, learn from the mistake. But shame mixed with disgust becomes unbearable. The disgust makes the shame feel permanent, like a stain that can't be removed. And the shame makes the disgust internal, impossible to escape. You see this in perfectionism. Every error triggers shame, and the shame triggers self-disgust. The person becomes hypervigilant, scanning constantly for mistakes, because each one confirms what they already suspect: that they're fundamentally defective. The disgust doesn't distinguish between minor errors and serious failures. It treats them all as evidence of internal contamination. You see it in trauma. Something violating happens, and the person feels both shame and disgust. The shame says they should have prevented it. The disgust says they're now tainted. The two emotions fuse, creating a sense of being permanently damaged. And because disgust is aimed at the self, there's no distance to create. You can't avoid yourself. What makes the shame-disgust link so destructive is that it turns normal self-correction into self-rejection. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone falls short sometimes. But when those moments trigger disgust, they stop being opportunities for growth and become proof of unworthiness. The shame says you failed. The disgust says you are failure. The link also resists reassurance. Someone tells you the mistake wasn't that bad, that you're being too hard on yourself. But the disgust doesn't respond to reason. It's a visceral response, and it persists even when you know intellectually that you're overreacting. The feeling outlasts the logic, keeping the shame-disgust cycle alive long after the triggering event has passed. Disgust Intolerance. Some people experience disgust and move on. They encounter something unpleasant, feel the revulsion, and then it fades. Others can't. The feeling sticks. It loops. It intensifies. A minor trigger produces a reaction that lasts hours, sometimes days. The disgust doesn't just happen and pass. It becomes an ongoing state, something they can't shake no matter how much they try. Disgust intolerance is the inability to tolerate or regulate disgust responses, resulting in prolonged distress and compulsive attempts to eliminate the feeling. The intolerance amplifies the disgust. A normal person might feel briefly uncomfortable. Someone with disgust intolerance feels overwhelmed, trapped in a reaction they can't control. The intolerance shows up in compulsive behaviors. Washing hands repeatedly, not because they're dirty, but because the feeling of contamination won't go away. Avoiding places, people, or situations because the thought of encountering the trigger produces unbearable anticipatory disgust. The behaviors aren't about the external threat. They're about escaping the internal feeling. The compulsions provide temporary relief. Wash your hands and for a moment the disgust lessens. Avoid the trigger and you feel safer. But the relief doesn't last. The disgust returns, often stronger than before. Because avoidance and compulsions reinforce the idea that the disgust is dangerous, that it's something to be feared. And the more you fear it, the more intense it becomes. You see this in contamination-based disorders. Intrusive thoughts about impurity trigger disgust that won't resolve. The person tries to think their way out of it, to prove to themselves that they're clean. But the disgust doesn't respond to evidence. It responds to feelings, and the more they focus on it, trying to make it go away, the more persistent it becomes. You see it in social anxiety. The thought of others seeing your flaws triggers shame, and the shame triggers disgust. The disgust is so intolerable that you withdraw completely, avoiding situations where it might arise. But the avoidance makes the next exposure worse. The intolerance grows with each retreat. What makes disgust intolerance so exhausting is that it turns disgust from a signal into a prison. Disgust evolved to be brief. Feel it, avoid the threat, move on. But intolerance locks you in the feeling. You can't move on. You can't regulate it. It sits there, constant and overwhelming, demanding attention and action that never fully resolve it. The intolerance also creates secondary problems. You're not just dealing with the disgust. You're dealing with the fear of the disgust, the anticipation of it, the exhaustion of trying to prevent or eliminate it. Your life narrows around avoiding triggers, and the avoidance confirms that the disgust is something unbearable. The loop tightens, and breaking it requires confronting the very thing the intolerance tells you to avoid, the feeling itself. Avoidance rituals. Check the lock. Check it again. Walk back from the end of the driveway to check one more time. You know it's locked. You tested it. But the doubt creeps back, and with it, the anxiety that if you don't check, something terrible will happen. So you check, and the relief lasts only until you're out of sight and the doubt returns. Avoidance rituals are the repetitive behaviors people perform to prevent or neutralize feelings of disgust and contamination. The rituals aren't about actual safety. They're about managing an internal feeling that won't resolve on its own. And the more you perform them, the more necessary they become. The pattern starts reasonably. You wash your hands after using the bathroom. Normal. But if disgust is involved, normal isn't enough. You wash longer. You use more soap. You develop a specific sequence that has to be followed exactly, or the contamination doesn't feel removed. The ritual grows more elaborate with each repetition. The rituals provide temporary relief. Perform the behavior and the disgust lessens. For a moment, you feel clean, safe, in control. But the relief never lasts. The doubt creeps back. Did you do it correctly? Did you miss a spot? Was the soap enough? And the questions trigger the disgust again, stronger than before, demanding another round. You see this with checking behaviors. touch something that feels contaminated, and you have to verify it's been cleaned. You check once, then twice. Then you develop elaborate checking sequences, touching in specific patterns, counting to specific numbers, repeating until it feels right. The ritual becomes compulsory, not because it works, but because not doing it feels unbearable. You see it in avoidance patterns that masquerade as preference. You take the long route to avoid a street where something disgusting happened. You develop elaborate rules about what you can touch, where you can sit, who you can interact with. The avoidance feels like sensible caution. But it's not based on risk. It's based on preventing the feeling of disgust from arising in the first place. What makes avoidance rituals so trap-like is that they work just enough to keep you doing them. Each time you perform the ritual, you avoid the full force of the disgust. So your brain learns that the ritual is necessary, that without it, disaster will strike. The relief reinforces the behavior, and the behavior reinforces the belief that the disgust was dangerous to begin with. The rituals also escalate. What started as washing hands for 30 seconds becomes washing for 5 minutes. What started as checking the lock once becomes checking it 10 times. The threshold for feeling safe keeps rising, because the ritual itself never addresses the real problem. It's not cleaning contamination. It's trying to eliminate a feeling, and feelings don't respond to external actions the way objects do. Avoidance rituals don't just take time. They take space. They narrow your world, creating zones you can't enter, objects you can't touch, people you can't be near. And the narrower your world becomes, the harder it is to recognize that the rituals aren't protecting you from contamination. They're protecting you from a feeling that was never actually dangerous. Aversive imagery. Close your eyes and try not to think about it. The image is already there. Vivid. Intrusive. Something disgusting, something you don't want in your head. But trying to push it away makes it stronger. The more you resist, the more it dominates your thoughts, until the image itself feels contaminating, as if seeing it in your mind is the same as being exposed to the real thing. Aversive imagery is the experience of intrusive, disgust-inducing mental images that trigger the same revulsion as actual stimuli. The images aren't chosen. They arise involuntarily, often in response to anxiety or stress. And once they appear, they're difficult to dismiss, creating a cycle where the attempt to suppress them makes them more persistent. The images vary. For some, it's graphic scenes of injury or decay. For others, it's contamination scenarios, imagining themselves touching something impure. The content doesn't matter as much as the response. The image triggers disgust, and the disgust makes the image feel threatening, as if harboring it in your mind makes you complicit. The imagery operates through the same mechanism as mental contamination. Your brain treats the thought as if it's real. Imagine touching something disgusting, and your body responds with the same revulsion as actual contact. The nausea rises. The urge to cleanse activates. You didn't touch anything. But your mind doesn't distinguish between imagination and reality when disgust is involved. Suppression makes it worse. You tell yourself not to think about it, and your brain, in monitoring whether you're still thinking about it, keeps bringing it back. The image returns often more vivid than before. And each return reinforces the idea that there's something wrong with you for having these thoughts, intensifying the disgust aimed at yourself. You see this with intrusive thoughts about contamination. Someone imagines their hands covered in filth, and the image won't leave. They wash compulsively, trying to cleanse what isn't physically there. But the washing doesn't remove the image. It just confirms that the image represented a real threat, making it more likely to return. You see it with fears of moral contamination. Someone imagines doing something they find disgusting, and the image feels like evidence of their true nature. They didn't do it. They don't want to do it. But the fact that they thought it feels contaminating, as if the boundary between thought and action has collapsed. What makes aversive imagery so distressing is that it turns your own mind into a source of contamination. You can avoid external triggers. You can cleanse physical contact. But you can't escape your thoughts. And when those thoughts produce disgust, there's nowhere to retreat. The contamination is internal, constant, and every attempt to eliminate it only makes it more present. Nausea Anticipation. You're heading to a medical appointment. Nothing invasive, just a routine check. But as the day approaches, your stomach tightens. You start feeling queasy hours before you even leave the house. By the time you arrive, you're genuinely nauseated, not from anything that's happened, but from the anticipation of something that might trigger disgust. Nausea anticipation is the phenomenon where expecting to encounter a disgust trigger produces physical nausea before any actual exposure. The anticipation alone is enough to activate the body's disgust response, creating symptoms that are indistinguishable from reactions to real stimuli. The mechanism is conditioning. You've encountered the trigger before. You know what it feels like. And your brain, in preparing you to handle it, activates the same response in advance. The nausea is meant to be protective, a warning system to keep you away from potential contamination. But it fires based on prediction, not reality. The anticipation builds as the encounter approaches. Days before, you feel mild unease. Hours before, the unease becomes dread. Minutes before, the dread becomes physical nausea. By the time you're actually exposed to the trigger, if you even make it that far, you're already in the grip of a full disgust response. You see this with medical procedures. The thought of blood draws, injections, or examinations produces nausea long before the appointment. The anticipation is often worse than the procedure itself. People cancel, reschedule, avoid entirely, not because the procedure is unbearable, but because the anticipation is. You see it with social situations involving food. Someone invited to dinner knows certain foods will be served that they find disgusting. The anticipation ruins the event before it starts. They feel nauseated thinking about it, rehearse excuses to avoid eating, and arrive already in a state of physical distress. What makes nausea anticipation so debilitating is that it punishes you for things that haven't happened yet. You're not reacting to contamination. You're reacting to the idea of contamination. And because the nausea is real, it confirms that the threat is real, making the anticipation stronger the next time. The anticipation also creates avoidance. If thinking about something makes you physically sick, you stop thinking about it. You avoid planning for it. You cancel when possible. And the avoidance prevents you from learning that the anticipated disgust might not be as overwhelming as your body predicted. The cycle locks in place, with anticipation producing nausea, nausea justifying avoidance, and avoidance strengthening anticipation. Ingroup purity concern. A new person joins the group. They're qualified. They're friendly. But something about them doesn't fit. Not their skills. Not their personality. Something harder to name. A sense that their presence dilutes what the group is supposed to be. And without anyone saying it directly, the group starts pulling away, creating subtle distance, enforcing boundaries that keep the newcomer on the margins. Ingroup purity concern is the drive to maintain symbolic cleanliness within a group by excluding members who threaten its perceived purity. The concern isn't about diversity of thought or protecting against actual harm. It's about preserving an idealized sense of what the group represents, and anyone who doesn't align with that ideal gets treated as contamination. The purity standards are often unspoken. No one writes down the rules, but everyone knows them. The way people dress, the topics they avoid, the values they signal. Step outside those invisible boundaries and you're marked, not as wrong, as impure. And impurity in group logic spreads. The concern manifests as vigilance. Members scan for violations, for signs that someone doesn't truly belong, a comment that feels off, a choice that doesn't align, an association with someone outside the group. Each deviation gets noted, discussed quietly, used as evidence that the person is contaminating the group's purity. The exclusion happens through subtle mechanisms. Invitations stop coming. Conversations end when the person approaches. Their contributions get dismissed or ignored. The group doesn't announce the exclusion. It just enacts it, creating a social vacuum that pushes the person out without anyone having to articulate why. You see this in ideological communities. Someone questions a core belief, not to attack it but to understand it better. The group treats the question as contamination. The person is accused of being impure, of bringing in outside influences that threaten the group's cohesion. And the accusation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The person either conforms completely or leaves. You see it in social hierarchies based on status markers, wealth, education, background. Someone doesn't have the right markers, and they're treated as if their presence lowers the group's overall standing. The exclusion isn't about what they've done. It's about what they represent, a reminder that the group's purity is fragile, always one wrong member away from collapse. What makes in-group purity concern so insidious is that it feels like maintaining standards. The group isn't being cruel. It's being discerning. It's protecting what makes it special. The disgust provides the moral framing, turning exclusion into quality control. And the people excluded aren't rejected for their actions. They're rejected for failing to embody an ideal that may have been impossible to meet from the start. Stigma-Linked Disgust. Someone mentions they have a chronic illness. The conversation shifts immediately. Not in what's said, in what's felt. A discomfort enters the room. People pull back, subtly. Eye contact becomes harder to maintain. The illness itself isn't contagious, but the stigma attached to it triggers a disgust response that treats the person as if they're contaminated. Stigma-linked disgust is the revulsion directed at people based on characteristics or conditions that society has marked as impure. The disgust isn't about actual threat. It's about symbolic contamination, the sense that certain traits, certain identities, certain histories make a person fundamentally tainted. The stigma operates through association. The condition or trait gets linked to disgust through cultural narratives, stereotypes, repeated pairings in media and conversation. Once the link is established, encountering someone with that trait triggers the disgust automatically. The person becomes inseparable from the stigma. The disgust manifests as avoidance. People keep physical distance. They minimize interaction. They avoid touching objects the stigmatized person has handled. The avoidance feels instinctive, justified, like protecting oneself from contamination. But there's no actual contamination. Just the feeling that proximity is dangerous. You see this with mental illness. Someone discloses depression or anxiety, and others start treating them differently. Not with concern, with discomfort. The stigma carries the implication that mental illness is a form of weakness, of impurity, something that might spread if you get too close. The disgust creates distance that isolates the person further. You see it with addiction. Someone in recovery mentions their past, and the disgust is palpable. They're judged not for what they're doing now, but for what they did before. The history of addiction becomes a permanent stain, something that marks them as contaminated regardless of how much time has passed or how much they've changed. You see it with physical disabilities. The disgust isn't about the disability itself. It's about what the disability represents. A reminder of vulnerability, of the body's fragility, of the possibility that you could end up in the same situation. The disgust creates distance from that anxiety, but it does so by treating the disabled person as something to be avoided. What makes stigma-linked disgust so damaging is that it's socially reinforced. The disgust doesn't stay private. It gets expressed through jokes, through avoidance, through policies that exclude stigmatized groups. And each expression reinforces the link, teaching new generations that these people are disgusting, that the revulsion is natural and justified. The disgust also resists counter-evidence. You can meet someone who defies every stereotype associated with their stigmatized trait. Kind, competent, successful. And the disgust remains, because it's not based on the person's actual qualities. It's based on the category they've been sorted into, and categories, once marked as impure, are nearly impossible to cleanse. Moralized cleanliness. Two people prepare meals in their kitchens. Both are hygienic. Both follow food safety guidelines, but one treats cleanliness as preference, the other as morality. For the second person, a dirty counter isn't just inconvenient. It's wrong. A violation. And anyone who doesn't maintain the same standards isn't just different. They're morally lesser. Moralized cleanliness is the psychological fusion of physical hygiene with moral virtue, where being clean becomes a proxy for being good. The fusion transforms cleanliness from a practical concern into an ethical imperative, and anyone who falls short gets judged not just as messy, but as morally deficient. The moralization happens through disgust. Dirt triggers revulsion, and the revulsion gets interpreted as a moral signal. If something disgusts you, your brain treats it as wrong, not just unpleasant. And if being dirty is wrong, being clean must be right. The logic is circular, but it feels true because disgust is such a powerful emotion. The standards become rigid. There's a correct way to clean, a proper level of cleanliness, and deviation in either direction feels like moral failure. Too clean, and you're obsessive. Not clean enough, and you're slovenly. But the sweet spot is narrow, and it's defined by the person doing the judging, not by any objective standard. You see this in households where cleanliness is enforced as a moral issue. Children are taught that being messy is shameful, that leaving things out is disrespectful, that dirt is evidence of bad character. The lessons aren't about hygiene. They're about virtue, and the child learns to tie their self-worth to how clean they keep their space. You see it in judgments about others. Someone's home is cluttered, and you feel disgusted. Not just uncomfortable, morally repelled. You judge them as lazy, as lacking discipline, as fundamentally flawed. The mess becomes evidence of deeper character defects, and your disgust provides the justification. What makes moralized cleanliness problematic is that it turns practical differences into moral hierarchies. People have different standards for cleanliness, different capacities, different priorities. But when cleanliness is moralized, those differences become judgments about worth. The person who can't maintain high cleanliness standards, whether due to disability, mental health, poverty, or simple preference, gets treated as morally inferior. The moralization also creates shame spirals. You internalize the belief that cleanliness equals goodness. Then life gets overwhelming, and you can't maintain your usual standards. The mess accumulates. And instead of seeing it as a practical problem, you see it as moral failure. The shame makes it harder to clean, because each moment of cleaning reminds you of how far you've fallen. The disgust you feel toward the mess becomes disgust toward yourself. Moralized cleanliness doesn't protect anyone. It just creates another axis for judgment, another way to sort people into categories of pure and impure. And the sorting happens through disgust, which means it bypasses reason and lands directly as feeling. The person who doesn't meet your cleanliness standards doesn't just have different habits. They feel wrong. And that feeling, once established, is nearly impossible to shake. Grooming aversion. Someone reaches out to fix your collar. A small gesture. Helpful, even. But the moment their hand moves toward you, something inside recoils. You step back instinctively, mumble a thanks and adjust it yourself. It's not about them. It's about being touched in a way that feels invasive, even when it's meant to help. Grooming aversion is the disgust response triggered by unwanted physical contact related to personal maintenance, appearance, or bodily care. The touch doesn't have to be aggressive or inappropriate. Sometimes it just has to be unexpected, too intimate, or directed at parts of the body that feel private. And once the aversion is triggered, the contact feels intolerable. The response varies in intensity. For some, it's limited to strangers. Hairdresser touching their scalp produces discomfort they have to suppress. A dentist working in their mouth triggers revulsion they can't fully hide. For others, even close relationships carry the aversion. A partner trying to help with skincare or grooming meets resistance that seems disproportionate. The aversion links to control. Grooming is intimate. It involves parts of the body you usually manage yourself. When someone else takes over, even briefly, it disrupts the boundary between your body and their touch. And if that boundary feels fragile, the disruption triggers disgust as a way of reasserting control. You see this with children who resist being cleaned or dressed. The parent's touch, meant to care for them, feels invasive. The child pulls away, fights back, turns a simple task into a battle. The resistance isn't defiance. It's the disgust system protecting bodily autonomy the only way it knows how. You see it in medical contexts. A nurse needs to examine you, and the clinical necessity doesn't override the disgust. The touch still feels wrong, intrusive, contaminating. You endure it because you have to, but the revulsion doesn't fade just because the contact is professional. What makes grooming aversion difficult is that it conflicts with social expectations. You're supposed to accept help. You're supposed to tolerate necessary touch. And when you can't, when the disgust is too strong, you're labeled difficult, overly sensitive, uncooperative. The aversion becomes a flaw rather than a boundary. The aversion also isolates. Grooming is often how people express care. Fixing someone's appearance, helping them with their hair, adjusting their clothes. When those gestures trigger disgust, the care gets rejected, and the person offering it feels rebuffed, not understanding that the rejection isn't personal. It's visceral. Disgust amplification under stress. Everything feels manageable until it doesn't. You're handling work, responsibilities, the usual pressures. Then something tips. A deadline. A conflict. An unexpected demand. And suddenly, things that normally wouldn't bother you become unbearable. The smell of someone's lunch makes you nauseous. A minor mess looks catastrophic. Your tolerance collapses, and disgust floods in where it didn't exist before. Disgust amplification under stress is the phenomenon where stress lowers your threshold for disgust, making previously tolerable stimuli suddenly revolting. The triggers haven't changed. Your capacity to handle them has. And when you're already overwhelmed, disgust becomes another layer of distress you can't manage. The amplification happens through resource depletion. Regulating disgust requires mental energy. You have to override the automatic response, rationalize that the trigger isn't actually dangerous, suppress the urge to avoid or cleanse. When stress drains your resources, that regulation fails. The disgust response runs unchecked, and stimuli that you'd normally dismiss become overwhelming. The effect is immediate. You're calm, and a cluttered desk is just clutter. You're stressed, and the same desk triggers revulsion. You can't focus. You can't work. The mess feels contaminating, like it's spreading chaos into your mind. And cleaning it becomes urgent, even though rationally you know it's not the priority. You see this with sensory overload. Too much noise, too many people, too much input, and your disgust threshold drops. Someone stands too close, and instead of mild discomfort, you feel visceral revulsion. A normally acceptable smell becomes intolerable. Your body is telling you it's had enough, and disgust is the signal. You see it in relationships under strain. When things are good, minor habits don't register. When stress builds, those same habits become disgusting. The way someone chews. The sound they make when they breathe. The disgust wasn't dormant. It was suppressible, and stress removed the suppression. What makes disgust amplification dangerous is that it creates false information about your relationships and environment. You start believing that the disgust is about the person or the place, when it's actually about your stress level. And if you don't recognize the amplification, you make decisions based on temporary disgust that wouldn't exist if you were rested. The amplification also escalates stress. You're already overwhelmed, and now you're dealing with intense disgust reactions on top of everything else. The disgust adds another layer of distress, and the distress amplifies the disgust further. The cycle feeds itself until you either remove the stressor or collapse under the weight of both. Selective disgust triggers. Ask someone what disgusts them, and the answer is never everything. It's specific. Blood doesn't bother them, but vomit does. Insects are fine, but slugs are unbearable. Rotten food triggers revulsion, but dirty dishes don't. The disgust is selective, and the pattern, when you look closely, often reveals something about what the person fears most. Selective disgust triggers are the specific stimuli that provoke strong disgust responses while similar stimuli do not. The selectivity isn't random. It's shaped by experience, by what the person has learned to associate with threat, by what their particular disgust system has been tuned to detect. The selectivity emerges through conditioning. One bad experience with a particular trigger, and it becomes permanently disgusting. Other similar things might not trigger the same response because they weren't part of that original pairing. The disgust doesn't generalize across the entire category. It stays locked to the specific thing that caused it. You see this with food. Someone can't stand the texture of mushrooms but eats other spongy foods without issue. The disgust isn't about texture in general. It's about mushrooms specifically. Maybe they got sick once after eating them. Maybe they were forced to eat them as a child. The origin doesn't matter. The association stuck, and now mushrooms alone trigger the response. You see it with bodily substances. Some people are disgusted by blood but unbothered by other fluids. Others can handle blood but gag at the sight of mucus. The selectivity reveals what their disgust system has learned to mark as contaminating. And once marked, the specificity rarely changes. The selectivity also creates confusion in relationships. Your partner is disgusted by something that doesn't bother you at all. You can't understand why they're reacting so strongly. It seems irrational, disproportionate. But for them, the trigger is real. Their disgust system has been trained to respond to that specific thing, and no amount of logic can override it. What makes selective disgust triggers difficult is that they're hard to predict. You can't assume that because someone handles one type of disgust well, they'll handle related types the same way. Each person's disgust map is unique, shaped by their history, their conditioning, their particular vulnerabilities. And those maps rarely align perfectly with anyone else's. The selectivity also means that avoidance becomes targeted. You don't avoid everything, just the specific triggers, and that targeted avoidance can look arbitrary to others, like you're being picky or dramatic. But the disgust is as real as if the trigger were universally revolting. It's just that only you can feel it. Body boundary threat. Someone moves into your personal space without asking. Not aggressively, just closer than you'd like. And immediately, before you even process what's happening, your body tenses. You step back, create distance. The reaction isn't about politeness. It's about protecting a boundary that, when crossed, triggers a feeling you can't quite name. Discomfort, intrusion, and underneath it, disgust. Body boundary threat is the experience of disgust triggered when someone or something violates the invisible perimeter around your body. The boundary isn't physical. It's psychological. But crossing it feels like contamination, like something impure is getting too close, threatening to make contact and leave a residue you won't be able to remove. The boundary size varies. Some people have wide boundaries. They're comfortable with crowded spaces, casual touch, proximity to strangers. Others have narrow boundaries that extend far beyond their physical body. Someone standing 2 feet away feels invasive. A stranger's belongings placed near theirs feels contaminating. The disgust activates not at contact, but at the threat of contact. The threat intensifies with certain people. A stranger on the bus sits next to you, and the disgust is immediate. A A friend sits in the same spot and you barely notice. The difference isn't the proximity. It's the perceived contamination risk. The stranger represents unknown hygiene, unknown habits, unknown moral character. And all of that uncertainty gets processed as threat. You see this in crowded environments. The subway at rush hour, a packed concert. Bodies pressed together, unavoidable contact. For people with sensitive body boundaries, the experience is torturous. Every touch feels contaminating. Every breath of shared air feels impure. They endure it, but the disgust builds with each moment, creating a desperate need to escape and cleanse. You see it with objects. Someone uses your phone without asking, and even though it's not damaged, it feels tainted. The boundary around your belongings extends to the objects themselves, and when someone crosses it, the disguster takes to the object, making it feel contaminated by association. What makes body boundary threat so isolating is that it's invisible to others. They don't see the boundary. They don't understand why their presence triggers such a strong reaction. And explaining it is nearly impossible, because the boundary isn't rational. It's felt. And asking someone to respect a felt boundary that they can't perceive often comes across as rejection. The threat also creates chronic stress in social situations. You're constantly monitoring proximity, adjusting position, creating distance. The vigilance is exhausting. And the disgust that arises when the boundary is crossed leaves you feeling contaminated long after the interaction ends, sometimes for hours, sometimes longer. Visceral rejection. There are moments when disgust doesn't build gradually. It hits all at once. Full force. Instant. Instant. You see something, smell something, imagine something, and your body rejects it before your mind even registers what's happening. Nausea rises. Your stomach clenches. You might gag, you might turn away, but the response is already in motion, unstoppable, beyond your control. Visceral rejection is the immediate, overwhelming disgust response that bypasses conscious evaluation and triggers physical symptoms of revulsion. It's the body's emergency system, designed to expel or avoid contamination instantly. And when it activates, there's no reasoning with it. The rejection happens, and you deal with the aftermath. The response is primal. It evolved to protect you from ingesting poison, from consuming decay, from contact with disease. And it works by making the threat so intolerable that avoidance is automatic. You don't have to decide to pull away. Your body does it for you. The triggers vary, but the pattern is consistent. Core disgust stimuli, vomit, feces, rotting flesh, produce visceral rejection almost universally. But individual triggers can be just as powerful. Someone with a phobia of insects sees a spider, and the visceral rejection is as strong as if they'd encountered actual contamination. The rejection doesn't stop at avoidance. It produces physical symptoms. Nausea. Gagging. In extreme cases, vomiting. The body is trying to expel something that isn't even inside you. The response is so strong that the mere thought of the trigger, the mental image of it, can produce the same physical reaction as actual exposure. You see this in medical contexts. Blood phobias where the sight of blood produces fainting. Not from fear, but from disgust so intense the body shuts down. The visceral rejection overrides everything else, including consciousness. You see it in social situations where someone's behavior is so disgusting that you physically can't remain in their presence. The rejection isn't about politeness. It's about survival. Your body has categorized their behavior as contamination, and staying means exposure. What makes visceral rejection so absolute is that it removes choice. You can't will yourself to tolerate the trigger. You can't reason your way through the response. The body has decided and the decision is final. And that lack of control, that inability to override the response even when you want to, can be as distressing as the disgust itself. Ritual purification urge. You made a mistake. Not a major one. Just something that made you feel bad about yourself. And now you can't stop thinking about it. But the thinking isn't productive. It's searching. searching for a way to undo it, to cleanse yourself of the feeling it left behind. You apologize again, even though you already did. You confess to someone who doesn't need to know. You engage in some ritual, physical or mental, that's supposed to make you feel clean again. And for a moment, it works. Until the feeling returns. Ritual purification urge is the compulsion to perform specific behaviors aimed at removing feelings of moral or psychological contamination. The urge treats emotional and moral impurity as if they were physical dirt, something that can be washed away, confessed away, atoned for through repetitive action. And the rituals provide temporary relief, just enough to keep you performing them. The urge emerges from the fusion of disgust and guilt. You feel disgusted with yourself, and the disgust demands cleansing. But because the contamination is internal, psychological, no external ritual can truly remove it. So you perform the ritual anyway, hoping this time it will work. This time the feeling will go away permanently. The rituals take many forms. Physical cleaning that goes beyond hygiene. Washing hands until they're raw. Showering multiple times a day. The cleaning isn't about dirt. It's about trying to wash away a feeling. And the feeling, being psychological, doesn't respond to soap. Confession rituals where you repeatedly admit to the same mistake, seeking reassurance that you're still a good person. The reassurance provides temporary relief. But the doubt returns, and with it, the urge to confess again. Each cycle reinforces the belief that you need external validation to feel clean. Avoidance rituals where you stay away from anything associated with the contaminating event. Places, people, objects. The avoidance is meant to prevent recontamination, but it also prevents you from learning that the contamination was never real to begin with. You see this in scrupulosity, the religious or moral form where every small transgression triggers the purification urge. The person confesses, performs rituals, seeks absolution. But the relief never lasts because the disgust isn't about the behavior. It's about the feeling, and feelings don't submit to rituals designed for physical cleansing. You see it in relationships where betrayal triggers the urge. The betrayed person demands repeated apologies, endless explanations, performative demonstrations of remorse. The rituals are meant to purify the relationship, to remove the contamination of the betrayal. But betrayal is psychological, and no ritual can undo what was done. What makes the ritual purification urge so exhausting is that it promises relief it can't deliver. Each ritual works briefly, reinforcing the belief that purification is possible. But the contamination always returns because it was never external to begin with. It's internal, psychological, immune to the rituals being performed. And recognizing that, accepting that the feeling can't be washed away, is often more unbearable than continuing the rituals indefinitely. Contagion Heuristic. One drop of juice falls into a glass of water. The water is still clean, still safe to drink. But you hesitate. The thought of consuming it feels wrong, as if that single drop has somehow spread throughout the entire glass, contaminating every molecule. Logically, you know the dilution makes it negligible. But the feeling tells you otherwise. The feeling says once contaminated, always contaminated. The contagion heuristic is the mental shortcut your brain uses to assess contamination risk. It operates on a simple rule. Once something touches something impure, it becomes impure itself. The amount doesn't matter. The duration doesn't matter. Contact is enough. And the contamination spreads instantly, completely, permanently. The heuristic evolved for survival. In a world without microscopes or germ theory, assuming that contamination spreads rapidly kept you safe. Better to treat a slightly contaminated food source as entirely ruined than to risk consuming it. The cost of caution was low. The cost of being wrong was death. But the heuristic doesn't distinguish between real contamination and symbolic contamination. It applies the same rule to physical threats and psychological ones. Someone you dislike touches your belongings, and those belongings feel contaminated. No actual substance transferred. But the heuristic treats the contact as if it did. The rule operates on magical thinking. A single drop of sewage in a barrel of wine makes the wine undrinkable. But a drop of wine in a barrel of sewage doesn't make the sewage better. Contamination spreads in one direction. Purity doesn't. And once something is contaminated, no amount of dilution, no amount of cleaning fully restores it. You see this with food. A fly lands on your meal for a second. You could remove the part it touched. You could rationalize that the risk is minimal. But the contagion heuristic has already decided. The meal is contaminated. The thought of eating it produces disgust that no reasoning can override. You see it with social judgments. Someone associates with a person you find morally disgusting, and now they're tainted by association. The contamination transferred through proximity. They didn't do anything wrong themselves. But the heuristic doesn't care. Contact equals contamination. What makes the contagion heuristic so powerful is its efficiency. You don't have to analyze risk carefully. You don't have to measure exposure. The heuristic gives you a fast answer, contaminated or not. And in environments where actual contamination is a threat, that speed saves lives. But in modern contexts, where most contamination is symbolic rather than physical, the heuristic creates false alarms. It treats social contact, moral association, even thoughts as if they're infectious. And once the heuristic fires, the contamination feels real, regardless of whether any actual transfer occurred. Magical contamination belief. A sweater was once worn by someone you admire. You know it's been washed. You know nothing of them remains in the fabric. But wearing it still feels different, special, as if something of their essence transferred to the garment and stayed there, waiting for you. The belief isn't rational. You know it's just cloth. But the feeling persists. The sweater carries something. Magical contamination belief is the psychological phenomenon where people treat contamination as if it operates through invisible essence rather than physical substance. The belief doesn't require actual material transfer. It requires association. And once that association is established, the object, person, or place carries the contamination permanently, regardless of any cleaning or separation. The belief operates through essence thinking. Your mind treats contamination as if it has a spiritual or invisible quality that can transfer between objects without any physical mechanism. Someone evil touches something and their evil essence soaks into it. Someone pure handles an item and their purity remains. The direction matters. Negative contamination is stronger than positive. An object touched by someone disgusting becomes permanently tainted. But an object touched by someone admirable doesn't gain equal virtue. The asymmetry reveals that the belief is rooted in threat detection. Contamination represents danger, and the brain errs on the side of treating potential threats as real. You see this with celebrity memorabilia. People pay enormous sums for items once owned by famous individuals. Not because the objects are functionally different, but because they carry the essence of the person who owned them. The essence makes the object valuable, as if proximity to greatness transferred something permanent into the material. You see it with objects associated with evil. A chair once sat in by a murderer feels contaminated. People don't want to touch it, don't want it in their homes. The chair itself did nothing. But the association with evil transferred an essence that makes the object feel dangerous, impure, wrong. The belief also affects places. A house where something terrible happened carries the contamination forward. New owners report feeling uncomfortable, sensing something off, even if they don't know the history. The contamination isn't physical. It's psychological. But it shapes how the space feels, making it difficult to inhabit. What makes magical contamination belief so persistent is that it doesn't respond to evidence. You can prove that no material transfer occurred. You can demonstrate that the object has been thoroughly cleaned. But the belief remains, because it's not about molecules or germs. It's about essence, and essence, being invisible and immaterial, can't be measured or removed. The contamination exists in the mind, not in the object. But the mind treats it as if it's real, and that belief is enough to make the object feel permanently tainted. Disgust-based social exclusion. Watch how a group responds when someone violates their unstated norms. The violation doesn't have to be severe. It can be minor. A comment that doesn't align. A choice that feels off. A habit that breaks from the group's unspoken code. The response isn't discussion. It's distance. People pull back. Conversations shift. Invitations stop. And the person who violated the norm finds themselves on the outside, often without understanding exactly what they did wrong. Disgust-based social exclusion is the process by which groups use disgust to enforce boundaries and remove members who threaten cohesion. The disgust operates as a mechanism of social control, creating pressure to conform without requiring explicit rules. And once triggered, it leads to exclusion that feels automatic, justified, necessary. The exclusion happens through subtle signals. No one announces that the person is being rejected, but the group enacts it anyway. Eye contact decreases. Physical distance increases. Responses become shorter, colder, less engaged. The person is still technically part of the group, but emotionally they've been pushed to the margins. The disgust provides the justification. The group doesn't need to articulate why the person is being excluded. The feeling is enough. They violated a purity standard, and the disgust marks them as contaminated. And contamination in group logic threatens everyone. So removing the source becomes a form of collective hygiene. The exclusion is contagious. One person feels disgust and pulls away. Others notice and follow. The collective response builds momentum, creating a social atmosphere where being associated with the excluded person carries risk. Defend them, and you might be marked as contaminated too. So most people stay silent, letting the exclusion proceed unopposed. You see this in workplaces. Someone makes a mistake that triggers moral disgust, and suddenly they're isolated. Colleagues stop collaborating with them. Their ideas get dismissed. They're left out of informal gatherings. The exclusion isn't official, but it's real. And it can be more damaging than formal discipline because there's no process, no appeal, no way to address it directly. You see it in social circles. Someone's behavior, once tolerated, suddenly becomes disgusting to the group. Maybe they changed. Maybe the group's standards shifted. Either way, the disgust activates and the person gets pushed out. Friendships dissolve. Invitations dry up. And the person is left wondering what happened, unable to pinpoint the moment everything changed. What makes disgust-based social exclusion so cruel is its invisibility. The excluded person knows they're being rejected, but they often don't know why. The disgust operates beneath explicit communication, expressed through behavior rather than words. And because the disgust feels like a natural response rather than a choice, the people enacting it don't see themselves as excluding anyone. They're just responding to their feelings. And those feelings tell them that distance is necessary, that the person is contaminated, and that maintaining the boundary protects the group. Facial disgust reactivity. Someone across from you bites into something they find delicious, and their face lights up. You feel nothing. They're enjoying it. Good for them. Then they offer you a taste, and before you even smell it, your face reacts. Your nose wrinkles. Your lip curls. The expression happens before you consciously register what the food is. Your face already knows. It's disgusting. Facial disgust reactivity is the automatic facial expression that occurs in response to disgust triggers. The expression is universal, hardwired into human biology, instantly recognizable across all cultures. And it happens so fast that conscious thought can't stop it. The face reacts, and the expression broadcasts your disgust to everyone around you before you even realize you're making it. The expression serves a dual function. Internally, it prepares your body to avoid or expel contamination. The nose wrinkles to close off airways. The lip curls to create distance from the mouth. The face contorts to reduce the chance of ingesting or inhaling the threat. Externally, it signals to others that danger is present, warning them to stay away from the same source. The reactivity is involuntary. You can try to suppress the expression, and sometimes you succeed in softening it. But you can't fully control it. The disgust triggers the facial muscles automatically, and the expression leaks through even when you're trying to hide it. A slight wrinkle. A brief curl. Enough for others to notice that something disgusted you. The expression also amplifies the emotion. Making the face of disgust intensifies the feeling. Your brain reads the facial feedback and interprets it as confirmation that the trigger is genuinely disgusting. The loop runs both ways. Disgust creates the expression, and the expression strengthens the disgust. You see this in social situations where hiding disgust is important. Someone serves you food you find revolting, and you try to keep your face neutral. But the expression breaks through. Your nose wrinkles for a fraction of a second. They see it, and the message is clear. You're disgusted. The attempt to be polite failed because the facial reactivity bypassed your control. You see it in judgments about others. Someone does something you find morally disgusting, and your face shows it before you speak. The expression reveals your disgust, and the person sees it. The damage is done. No words needed. Your face already communicated the judgment. What makes facial disgust reactivity so powerful is its honesty. You can lie with words. You can control your actions. But your face tells the truth. And that truth broadcast through an expression you can't fully suppress, shapes how others see you and how you see yourself. The expression isn't just a reaction. It's communication. And once it's visible, it can't be taken back. Sensitivity to grossness. Two people walk into the same public restroom. One glances around, uses the facilities, washes their hands, and leaves. The other notices everything. The grime on the floor, the smudges on the mirror, the faint smell they can't identify. They hover over the seat, avoid touching anything, use paper towels as barriers, and leave feeling contaminated. Same restroom. Entirely different experiences, and the difference isn't the space. It's the person's sensitivity to grossness. Sensitivity to grossness is the individual variation in how easily and intensely someone experiences disgust in response to unpleasant but common stimuli. Some people have low sensitivity. They can tolerate mess, ignore smells, handle things others would recoil from. Others have high sensitivity. Minor imperfections trigger strong disgust, and their world is full of things to avoid. The sensitivity shapes daily life. Low sensitivity people move through environments without much filtering. A cluttered kitchen doesn't bother them. A slightly dirty subway seat is fine. They focus on function, not cleanliness. High sensitivity people are constantly scanning, constantly adjusting, constantly managing their exposure to things that trigger disgust. The sensitivity isn't a choice. It's built into how their disgust system is calibrated. Some people's brains set the threshold low, triggering disgust frequently and intensely. Others set it high, requiring stronger stimuli to produce the same response. And that calibration affects everything from career choices to relationship compatibility. You see this in living situations. Roommates with mismatched sensitivity levels struggle. One person's normal level of cleanliness feels disgusting to the other. The high sensitivity person sees filth everywhere. The low sensitivity person sees the other as obsessive, unreasonable, impossible to satisfy. Neither is wrong. They're just operating with different disgust thresholds. You see it in food preferences. Someone with high sensitivity can't tolerate certain textures, certain smells, certain visual presentations. Foods that others enjoy are unbearable. The sensitivity doesn't make them picky. It makes those foods genuinely disgusting. The revulsion is real, even if others don't experience it. What makes sensitivity to grossness challenging is that it's invisible to others. High sensitivity people look around and see contamination everywhere. But low-sensitivity people see the same environment and see nothing wrong. The mismatch creates conflict, misunderstanding, judgment. The high-sensitivity person is labeled neurotic. The low-sensitivity person is labeled careless. But both are just responding to their internal calibration. The sensitivity also doesn't correlate with other traits the way people assume. High sensitivity doesn't mean someone is more moral, more disciplined, or more refined. It just means their disgust system fires more easily. And that difference, invisible but pervasive, shapes how they navigate the world, what they avoid, and who they can comfortably be around. Threat of corruption. You've built something. Maybe it's your reputation. Maybe it's your sense of self. Maybe it's a community you're part of. And it feels solid. Clean. Untainted. Then something comes along that threatens it. Not with force. With association. Someone morally questionable wants to join your group. An opportunity arises that would benefit you but comes from a compromised source. And the threat isn't that you'll be harmed. It's that you'll be corrupted. That the purity of what you've built will be contaminated by proximity to something impure. The threat of corruption is the fear that associating with morally tainted people, ideas, or sources will contaminate your own moral standing. The fear treats morality like hygiene. Purity can be lost through contact. And once lost, it's nearly impossible to fully restore. So the threat of corruption produces vigilance, avoidance, and sometimes aggressive boundary enforcement. The threat operates through contamination logic. You're clean. They're dirty. Get too close, and their dirt transfers to you. The transfer doesn't require you to do anything wrong. Proximity is enough. Association is enough. And once you're contaminated, others will see you differently. Treat you as if you carry the same moral stain. The fear shapes decisions in ways you don't always recognize. You turn down an opportunity because the person offering it has a questionable past. You distance yourself from someone whose behavior has become ethically suspect. You enforce strict boundaries about who can join your group, not because of what they might do, but because of what their presence might signal about you. You see this in reputational concerns. A business avoids partnering with a controversial figure, not because the partnership would be harmful, but because the association would taint their brand. The corruption threat isn't functional. It's symbolic. Being linked to someone impure makes you impure by proxy. You see it in moral communities. Someone questions a core value, and the group treats them as a corruption threat. Not because the question itself is dangerous, but because tolerating it might signal that the group's moral standards are slipping. The person gets expelled, not for what they did, but for what their presence represents. A crack in the purity the group worked to maintain. What makes the threat of corruption so powerful is that it's self-reinforcing. You avoid association with tainted sources to protect your purity. The avoidance works. You remain untainted. And the success confirms that the threat was real, that without vigilance you would have been corrupted. The fear becomes a permanent stance, shaping who you associate with, what opportunities you pursue, and how you respond to anyone who might compromise the purity you've worked to preserve. The threat also creates isolation. The more you fear corruption, the smaller your world becomes. You can't associate with anyone imperfect. You can't engage with ideas that might contaminate yours. You build walls to protect your purity, and those walls keep out not just contamination, but connection, growth, and the messy reality that purity, as an absolute standard, was always an illusion. Disgust avoidance learning. Touch a hot stove once and you learn not to touch it again. That's straightforward. Cause and effect. Pain and avoidance. But disgust works differently. You don't need to be harmed. You don't even need direct experience. Watch someone else eat something and get sick, and you'll avoid that food yourself. Hear about contamination in a certain place, and you'll stay away without ever encountering the threat firsthand. Disgust learning happens fast, spreads wide, and sticks permanently. Disgust avoidance learning is the process by which your brain acquires new disgust responses and avoidance patterns without requiring direct exposure to harm. The learning is efficient. One observation, one story, one pairing, and the association locks in, creating avoidance that can last a lifetime. The efficiency evolved for survival. If you had to personally consume every poisonous plant to learn which ones were dangerous, you wouldn't survive long. Better to learn from others' mistakes. Watch someone eat a mushroom and collapse, and your brain marks that mushroom as disgusting forever. You never had to taste it. You never had to suffer the consequences. The learning happened vicariously, instantly, and completely. The learning doesn't require logic. Someone tells you a food made them sick, and you avoid it, even if you know intellectually that their illness might have been unrelated. The association between the food and sickness has been established, and your disgust system treats it as fact. The feeling overrides the reasoning. You see this with culturally transmitted disgust. Children learn what's disgusting by watching their parents' reactions. The parent recoils from an insect, and the child learns that insects are threatening. The parent shows disgust towards certain foods, and those foods become disgusting to the child. The transmission happens without explanation, without harm, through pure observation. You see it with social learning about people. Your friend tells you someone is untrustworthy, describes behavior that disgusts them, and you inherit that disgust. You've never met the person. You have no direct experience, but the learning occurred through the story alone, and now you'd avoid them if given the chance. What makes disgust avoidance learning so powerful is its resistance to extinction. Most learned behaviors weaken when they're not reinforced. Touch the stove, realize it's not hot, and the fear fades. But disgust learning doesn't follow that pattern. Avoid the disgusting thing, and you never get the chance to learn it wasn't actually dangerous. The avoidance prevents correction, and the disgust stays, sometimes for life, based on a single piece of information that may not even have been accurate. The learning also generalizes aggressively. Learn to avoid one thing, and similar things become suspect. One bad experience with seafood, and all seafood carries the association. One disgust reaction to a person, and people who resemble them trigger the same response. The disgust spreads beyond the original source, creating avoidance patterns that extend far wider than the initial learning event. Disgust habituation failure. Exposure is supposed to reduce fear. Face the thing you're afraid of repeatedly, and eventually the fear weakens. The brain learns the threat isn't real. But disgust doesn't work that way. Expose yourself to something disgusting over and over, and the disgust doesn't fade. Sometimes it intensifies. The more you encounter it, the more unbearable it becomes. Disgust habituation failure is the phenomenon where repeated exposure to disgust triggers does not reduce the disgust response as it would with fear or anxiety. Instead of adapting, the disgust remains at full strength, or in some cases, amplifies with each exposure. The system refuses to habituate. The failure serves a function. Disgust evolved to protect you from contamination. And contamination doesn't become safe just because you've encountered it multiple times. Rotten food is still dangerous the 10th time you see it. Disease is still threatening no matter how often you're exposed. So the disgust system is designed not to adapt, to maintain full vigilance even with repeated contact. But the failure creates problems when the disgust is a take to things that aren't actually dangerous. A phobia of a harmless substance, maintained by disgust, won't resolve through exposure. The person encounters it repeatedly, hoping the revulsion will fade. But it doesn't. Each exposure confirms the disgust, sometimes making it stronger. You see this with contamination fears. Someone with obsessive concerns about germs washes their hands compulsively. The washing should eventually reduce the anxiety, teach them that the contamination isn't real. But it doesn't. Each time they wash, the disgust returns, and the compulsion continues, reinforced rather than weakened by repetition. You see it with food aversions. Force yourself to eat something you find disgusting, thinking you'll get used to it. You don't. The 10th bite is as revolting as the first. The disgust doesn't diminish with familiarity. If anything, it becomes more entrenched, as each exposure reminds your brain why the food should be avoided. What makes disgust habituation failure so frustrating is that it contradicts how most learning works. You expect that repeated safe exposure will teach your brain the threat isn't real. But disgust bypasses that logic. The response is hardwired to persist, to refuse adaptation, to maintain the warning signal regardless of evidence. And that persistence traps people in avoidance patterns that can't be resolved through the usual methods of confronting the fear. The failure also makes treatment difficult. Therapies that work for anxiety, exposure-based approaches where you gradually face the trigger, often fail with disgust. The exposure doesn't reduce the response. It just makes the person endure the revulsion repeatedly without relief. And eventually they stop trying because the disgust proves stronger than the treatment. Purity threat vigilance. You're at a gathering. Everything seems normal. But part of your attention is always scanning. Who touched what? Who's standing too close? Who's doing something that violates your internal standards? You're not paranoid. You're vigilant. Watching for threats to purity that others don't even notice. And the vigilance is exhausting, but you can't turn it off. Purity threat vigilance is the constant monitoring for potential contamination or violations of purity standards. The vigilance operates in the background, consuming attention and energy, creating a state of perpetual alertness for things that might threaten your sense of cleanliness or moral order. And once activated, it rarely rests. The vigilance emerges from high disgust sensitivity combined with rigid purity standards. Your threshold for contamination is low. Your standards for what's acceptable are narrow, and the combination means you're constantly encountering potential violations. The world feels full of threats, and staying pure requires constant monitoring. The monitoring isn't conscious deliberation. It's automatic scanning. Your eyes track who's touching shared surfaces. Your attention catches violations of hygiene others miss. Your mind registers moral transgressions that wouldn't bother most people. The vigilance runs without your permission, flagging threats you didn't ask to notice. You see this in people with contamination fears. They can't relax in public spaces because the vigilance is always active. Every surface is a potential threat. Every person a possible source of contamination. The monitoring consumes mental resources, making it hard to focus on anything else because part of the mind is always watching for danger. You see it in moral communities with strict purity codes. Members develop vigilance for violations. They notice who's drifting from the standards, who's associating with impure outsiders, who's questioning the rules. The vigilance becomes a form of boundary enforcement, where everyone monitors everyone else. And the constant surveillance maintains group cohesion through mutual accountability. What makes purity threat vigilance so draining is that it never ends. There's no moment of safety where you can stop watching. The threats are everywhere, constant, and the vigilance that's meant to protect you becomes its own burden. The mental energy spent scanning for contamination leaves less capacity for everything else. And the exhaustion builds, but the vigilance doesn't decrease. Because stopping the monitoring feels like lowering your defenses, leaving yourself vulnerable to contamination you can't risk. The vigilance also distorts perception. When you're constantly scanning for threats, you find them. Ambiguous situations get interpreted as violations. Innocent actions look suspicious. The vigilance creates a world where threats are everywhere, not because they objectively are, but because you're tuned to detect them. And the more you find, the more justified the vigilance feels, creating a loop where heightened alertness generates more perceived threats, which reinforces the need to stay vigilant. Disgust and distance regulation. Someone disgusts you, and without thinking, you step back. Create space. The movement is automatic. Not a conscious decision to increase distance. Your body does it for you. And the distance isn't just physical. Emotional distance follows. You disengage. Pull back from connection. And the further you retreat, the more entrenched the disgust becomes. Disgust and distance regulation is the psychological and physical mechanism by which disgust creates and maintains distance from its triggers. The regulation operates on a simple principle: proximity to disgust-inducing stimuli feels intolerable, and distance provides relief. So the system creates distance, enforces it, and punishes attempts to close the gap. The distance serves multiple functions. Physically, it reduces the risk of contamination. Keep away from the source and you can't be tainted. Emotionally, it protects you from the discomfort of sustained exposure. The further away you are, the less intense the disgust feels. Socially, it communicates boundaries. Your retreat signals to others that this person, this behavior, this situation is unacceptable. The regulation happens across multiple dimensions. Physical space increases. You move away, avoid the same locations, create geographical distance when possible. Emotional engagement decreases. You stop investing in the relationship, stop caring about the person's well-being, treat them as categorically different from people who matter. Social contact diminishes. Invitations stop. Communication becomes minimal. The distance expands until the person is effectively absent from your life. You see this in relationships that dissolve through disgust. No dramatic confrontation, no explicit ending, just increasing distance. The person who disgusts you gets texted less frequently. Plans get cancelled. Responses become shorter, colder. And eventually, the relationship exists only in memory, killed not by conflict but by the slow retreat disgust demanded. You see it in how groups handle members who violate purity norms. The group doesn't announce the exclusion. They just create distance. Physical space at meetings. Emotional detachment in interactions. Social silence when the person's name comes up. The distance does the work of exclusion without requiring anyone to formally expel the member. What makes disgust-driven distance regulation so effective is its self-reinforcing nature. Distance reduces disgust. Less exposure means less discomfort. And the relief confirms that the distance was necessary, that proximity is dangerous, that maintaining the gap protects you. The regulation becomes permanent, with each moment of separation strengthening the boundary that keeps you apart. The distance also makes reconciliation nearly impossible. Closing the gap means enduring increased disgust, and most people won't tolerate that discomfort, even when they intellectually understand that the disgust might not be justified. The feeling is too strong. The relief of distance too immediate. So the gap remains, maintained not by active choice, but by the automatic regulation system that refuses to let you get close. Affective revulsion memory. You haven't thought about it in years. Then something triggers the memory. Not just the event. The feeling. The exact nausea you felt. The precise way your stomach turned. The revulsion returns, vivid and physical, as if the thing that disgusted you is happening again right now. The memory isn't stored as information. It's stored as sensation. And when it resurfaces, you don't just remember being disgusted. You are disgusted all over again. Affective revulsion memory is the phenomenon where memories of disgust-inducing experiences retain their emotional and physical intensity over time. Unlike other memories that fade, that become abstract narratives you recall without reliving, disgust memories stay visceral. The effect, the feeling, the bodily response is preserved alongside the factual content. And reactivating the memory reactivates the disgust. The preservation serves a protective function. Disgust keeps you safe by making you remember what's dangerous. And to be effective, the memory can't just be intellectual knowledge. It has to carry the emotional weight that drives avoidance. So the brain stores disgust memories with full affective tags, ensuring that when you encounter the trigger again, or even think about it, the revulsion returns to keep you away. the intensity doesn't diminish with time. Memories from childhood can trigger disgust as strong as if they happened yesterday. The event itself might be trivial. Something you ate once that made you sick. A smell you encountered in a particular place. But the affective memory persists, and decades later, the disgust is still there, still powerful, still capable of producing physical nausea. You see this with food aversions that last a lifetime. One bad experience, often in childhood, and that food becomes permanently disgusting. The person can't even look at it without feeling nauseated. The affective memory is so strong that the mere sight triggers the full disgust response, complete with physical symptoms, even though the event that created it happened years or decades ago. You see it with places. Someone experiences something disgusting in a specific location, and that place carries the affective memory forward. Years later, returning to that location triggers the same revulsion. The place hasn't changed, but the memory has marked it, and the disgust resurfaces automatically, as fresh as the original experience. What makes affective revulsion memory so enduring is its resistance to cognitive reappraisal. You can know intellectually that the thing isn't dangerous anymore. You can understand that the disgust is based on outdated information. But the affective memory doesn't care. It stores the feeling, not the context. And when triggered, it delivers the full force of the original revulsion, overriding any rational evaluation you've developed since. The memory also gets reactivated easily. You don't need to encounter the actual trigger. A similar smell, a related image. Even thinking about it can be enough. The affective memory responds to cues, and once activated, it reproduces the disgust with startling fidelity. You're not vaguely remembering that something was disgusting. You're experiencing the disgust again in real time, as if the triggering event never ended. Disgust habituation resistance. Most aversions weaken over time. You're afraid of something, you face it repeatedly in safe contexts, and eventually the fear fades. Standard learning, standard adaptation. But disgust doesn't follow the script. Face the thing that disgusts you 100 times, and the 100th exposure can be just as revolting as the first. The system refuses to learn that the threat isn't real. Disgust habituation resistance is the brain's systematic refusal to reduce disgust responses through repeated safe exposure. It's not just that habituation is slow. It's that the disgust system actively resists it, treating each exposure as confirmation of the threat rather than evidence of safety. And that resistance makes disgust-based problems remarkably difficult to resolve. The resistance is built into the system's design. Disgust evolved to protect you from contamination, from disease, from consuming toxins. And those threats don't become safe just because you've survived them before. Bacteria don't stop being dangerous after your 10th exposure. Spoiled food remains toxic no matter how often you've avoided it. So the disgust system is calibrated to maintain vigilance, to refuse adaptation, to keep the warning signal at full strength. But when disgust takes to things that aren't actually dangerous, the resistance becomes a trap. The person knows intellectually that the trigger is harmless. They expose themselves to it, hoping the disgust will fade. But it doesn't. Each exposure triggers the same revulsion, and instead of learning that the thing is safe, their brain learns to expect the disgust every time they encounter it. You see this with phobias rooted in disgust. Someone terrified of insects tries exposure therapy. They look at pictures. They stand near containers with insects inside. They gradually increase proximity, but the disgust never weakens. Each exposure is as hard as the first. The resistance prevents the habituation that would make the phobia treatable. You see it with moral disgust. Someone did something you found morally revolting. Time passes. They apologize. They change. You encounter them repeatedly in neutral contexts. But the disgust remains. Each interaction triggers the same revulsion. The resistance prevents forgiveness, prevents reintegration, keeps the moral judgment locked in place regardless of how much time has passed or how much the person has changed. What makes disgust habituation resistance so frustrating is that it contradicts both intuition and most psychological principles. You expect that safe exposure seeks safety, that repeated contact without harm reduces the response. But disgust bypasses that learning. The system is designed not to habituate, and no amount of safe exposure overrides that design. The resistance is permanent, encoded, immune to the very mechanism that would normally resolve it.